comes the naughty bit. Oh, are we all right?
Here we go, vertigo, test for echo. Here we go, in slow-mo, video vertigo, test for echo. Test for echo.
Music began for me at around the age of 7 or 8 with the inevitable child's curse, piano lessons. And although I can't say that I enjoyed it a lot at the time, it did serve me well in the future. And music began for me in another way with a transistor radio that my mother gave to me at the age of about 10, and suddenly I understood the power of popular music and felt it in a fresh new way. When I started to get around 11 or 12 years old, I was banging around the house with chopsticks on my little sister's playpen and smashing up pots and pans, and my parents got the idea that I liked to hit things with sticks. So for my 13th birthday, they gave me drum lessons. This changed everything. I think one of the things that first made me interested in drumming was the Gene Krupa story. I think for a lot of young drummers was probably an inspiration, certainly was for me. This looked like something that was really cool. So I persuaded the drum lessons idea and became totally infatuated and obsessed with it. Had a really good teacher in the beginning by the name of Don George, who was both informative and really encouraging too. Out of all his students, he said that myself and a friend of mine, Kit, would be the only two that would end up being drummers, and that was the kind of encouragement that was so valuable to me at that time. And took drum lessons until he gave up teaching, and then I never found a teacher in the local area as good, so I just kind of followed his direction and kept on my own, coming home from school every night and playing along with the radio as long as my mother would allow, and just playing with whatever came on, so that I developed some ideal of versatility of being able to play whatever music was kind of shoved in my ears. And then it started with the usual process of playing in church concerts and high school variety shows and joining small bands, playing all our favorite songs and that kind of stuff, which took me up in the local area, playing with local bands till I was about 18. And then in about 1970, I got restless with the local scene and couldn't seem to find the level of ambition that I was feeling among local musicians, so I thought I've got to search farther afield. The nearest big city was Toronto, so I tried there, but same thing, it just didn't seem to be enough. So I decided to go to England. 18 years old, my father helped me build a crate. We packed up my drums and my records, and off I went to the mean streets of London. And I'd copied down a list of record companies, booking agencies, management companies, and so on from record jackets out of my collection, and traipsed around to all these offices in rainy London, basically knocking on doors. And I always remember one kind-hearted receptionist telling me, "Well, you're very brave." In other words, you're a fool. But I proceeded with that and eventually found another job to keep me alive, which was working in souvenir shops and poster shops in Carnaby Street and Piccadilly Circus. And through that, ironically, met musicians that I got started with in a band over there, and was able to do quite a variety of different work, playing in pop cover groups and some original pop music, a little bit of casual session work and stuff, and doing auditions through the Melody Maker newspaper, and a wealth of really good experience, such that it probably became the most formative and important part of my life. But at the same time, the fame and fortune that I was seeking was not forthcoming, and after a certain amount of hunger and suffering, I decided to go back home, a little disillusioned too that music business didn't work the way I thought it did. In my small town naivety and idealism, I had this strange notion that all you had to do was get good and you would be successful. Well, it wasn't that simple, as any grown-up learns. So I came back home and worked for my dad for a while in the farm equipment business. Lo and behold, one day, in walks a man who's a manager for a band called Rush. I hadn't heard of at the time, but they were looking for a drummer, and through a mutual friend had heard about me as possibly being suitable to the style they were looking for. So I went along for an audition, and the three of us sat in a rehearsal room in the suburbs of Toronto and talked about everything under the sun, from Monty Python movies to Tolkien books, and found we shared a lot of interests. And musically, when we played together, on some of their songs and some of the pieces and fragments that they were working on for their future, we found a real affinity there, that the style of drumming I had really suited the direction they wanted to go in. And so we began what has become now a 22-year odyssey together through many records and endless touring for years through the 70s and the 80s and now into the 90s. And I reached a point after 30 years of playing, after 20-odd years with the band, that I was feeling a little bit restless, not jaded or smug or overconfident by any means, but just that I'd honed a style of my own, and I felt like I was doing that style, playing myself about as well as I could, and I was unsure what to do with that information once I realized it. So it happened in the course of things that I had a bit of time between projects in the early 90s and produced a tribute to Buddy Rich, working with big band musicians and some of the finest drummers in the world. So in the course of this I met Steve Smith, and I'd known him for a few years. We'd worked together on a Jeff Berlin record a few years ago, but suddenly I noticed a massive growth in his playing, in his musicianship, and the musicality that he brought to his work, playing on the Buddy Rich sessions. And I asked him, Steve, what's your secret? And he gave me a one-word answer, Freddie. So I got curious about this, and I thought, well, what could a guy like Freddie Gruber do for me? Would it be worthwhile after 30 years of working away on my own and learning from all the other drummers of the world, maybe it's time I should take a little bit of time here and work with a teacher and see what might transpire. So I arranged to spend a week with Freddie in New York City now. And in the course of that, he watched me play for about 1 minute and then proceeded to give me a whole set of exercises and a whole new approach to the drums physically that really demanded that I start all over again. And that was a bit daunting in two ways. First of all, after 30 years to be starting all over again, but secondly because it would require me to start a discipline of practicing too that I hadn't had the luxury of with all these years of touring and recording and being devoted to that. But I did find the discipline to devote myself to this, to reinventing myself. So I started practicing every day down in the basement, went back to traditional grip for the first time in 30 years, and started learning the fluidity of motion that Freddie preached, and started trying to apply it to the way that I like to play the drums. And in the course of a year's time, I'm working on this day by day, meeting with Freddie every 6 months or so for a few days for an update, and then, as Freddie would say, to put the pieces together, take this thing a little further. So I was fired with his enthusiasm, and I've always liked the definition of enthusiasm as being infected with the God. And if there's anybody that's enthusiastic about music or drumming and infected with the God of drumming, it's certainly Freddie Gruber. So I found that I was making progress, and I could feel the growth, I could feel the fluidity coming into my playing, and the finesse of just practicing every day gave me a level of facility on the drums that I hadn't had before. And the other guys in the band started to talk about, you know, it's time we got together and started working on a project. And at that time I had to say, no, I'm going to need more time to do this. I have to give it at least time to mature, time for these things to take hold in my playing before I start trying to apply them. So I put off the band for another 6 months until I would have had a full year of working on Freddie's principles and working on the process of reinventing myself after 30 years, after all, was a fairly huge undertaking. So it came around to the end of that time, and then I'm working with the band again, wondering, I've completely reinvented myself, fine, but perhaps the previous invention, which was invented with the band, is more suitable to the music and more suitable to the band's approach. So even then I had to face the risk that all of that practicing every day and all of that work may have been, in the grand scheme of things of my professional work with the band, may have been for nothing, but certainly it was a gamble worth taking, and in the final result it turned out to be very much a part of our music and very much germane to the way I've always played. It just became me plus all these new elements, and some of the things that I've been hoping to achieve, less rigidity in timekeeping and so on, I was able to accomplish with a smoother, more relaxed and more rolling approach to the drums, while keeping the power and the action-packed busyness that I'm kind of known for, and is certainly a reflection of my character. True, and came to think perhaps were not true, have to do with the setting up of the drum set. I used to believe that it was most important to have everything as close under me as I could so that I wouldn't be unbalanced, so that everything I would be right on top of. Then through Freddie's ideas of round orbital motion, a beat being a point in a circle rather than a dot on a line, he got me into the idea of making things flow. The space between the beats is what counts. It happens in the air. Almost all of drumming, as with dancing or piano playing, it all happens in the air. So what he concentrates on is what happens between the beats. And as part of this circular motion, I came to realize that it was more important to get things comfortably part of that circle rather than right under me. So I moved the throne back a little bit, away from the bass drum and the snare, so that I had more room to have the circles happening between. Raised the snare drum quite a bit higher, so that again I was playing to the drum head instead of, we used to play like golfers, I think, playing straight through the drum, aiming for the floor. So all beats were just, going through the surface of the drum head. With Freddie's approach, the drum head is the end of the motion. Everything happens in the air, and the end of your circular motion is on the drum head or the cymbal. So all the circles have to happen above it. The ride cymbal I used to always have over here. Again, it seemed sensible because I would have a room for a tom-tom there, and I could play right over here fine. But when it came time to put these circular motions together, it was really not sensible, and I recognized that it would be better to do the traditional thing and have the ride cymbal here. And as with the toms, everything's set up ergonomically, the relationship of the machine to the person. Everything is set up for fluid motion so that I'm never having to be stilted or in any way cramped in my motions. Everything is a natural flow up and down through the toms to the cymbals. Everything can be part of that circle. The matched grip versus traditional grip is another interesting question, argument, debate. And for a long time, I played matched grip for most of my playing time because I thought it gave me more flexibility with the left hand, and that's what I was after, to be able to get it around more. There was a great story I always loved about Gene Krupa. It's claimed that he said, whether this is apocryphal or not, I don't know, but he used to shake hands with his left hand and say that I'm using my left hand more because I think it's underdeveloped. And I thought that's a great illustration of exactly what many drummers try to do. You try to get your left hand more active physically and musically around the drum set. So I had gone to matched grip for that reason, because I thought it allowed my left hand to travel around more and exert more even force throughout the range of motion. But while that may be true physically, and I think physiologically they've proven that more muscles can be brought into play on matched grip, and I thought, that proves it. And again, one of those things that seems to be true but perhaps isn't, because while it's true physically, perhaps it's not true musically, is what I've come to think lately, because the drum set revolves very much around ride cymbal, snare drum, bass drum, or over to the hi-hat. And getting these circular motions going, it's more important to have, I think, what the traditional grip allows is that kind of gathering of motion toward the body. And what I found it valuable for is in a musical sense, that I can get the rotating motion going on here on the snare to the cymbal, and I can develop the same kind of flexibility with the left hand around to all the other items of the drum set with a little bit of practice. And of course, after 30 years of playing matched grip, it was quite an effort in 1 year to reinvent a whole style of playing based around the traditional grip. And when I asked Freddie about that, Freddie, is this really what I should be spending my time on? Developing a whole new facility and a technique that I haven't been using for 30 years. And he just dismissed that like it's all the same, it doesn't matter. And it's true, many of the exercises that he gives me for thumb control and for hand control and so on can be done with matched grip as well as traditional. So it comes down to being a pretty small point, but it seems to me that in the fluidity of timekeeping and the fluidity of adding ghost notes and so on through the course of playing patterns to the cymbal or to the hi-hat, I was able to get a much nicer flow of rhythm and a much nicer pulse to the time sense by using traditional grip. So I stayed with it. I figured it was worth the experiment, and since I was going at this as being a process of reinventing myself and completely starting all over, it kind of added to the excitement of that, of starting in a whole new way, a completely fresh approach to the drum set after all those years. And the results proved themselves such that this whole album, for instance, was recorded completely using traditional grip. And I was able to find ways to get the power and the flexibility around the set that I needed. And also of critical concern, of course, in rock music is to be able to get the big downbeat, which is, in the past had always been, even playing matched grip with butt hand, was always a big whack available on the snare all the time. So there was tremendous consistency and power there. And I was concerned because, after all, I was making a record with Rush, kind of power on the downbeat. And I knew the way in the motion that Freddie was teaching me, it would eventually just be a snap of the wrist down onto the snare. And a year wasn't nearly enough to develop all the little tools that it takes to develop that motion, but it's something that I'm still working on and found ways to get around for now and at least get the job done while I'm still working towards developing that technique, so that I ended up using my thumb, as will be apparent in the video. The thumb's doing quite a bit of the work in giving me power down, where the fingers and the hand in general, through Freddie's exercises, is giving me quite a bit more dexterity in different areas and different ways of using the hands and the fingers. And the power, for now, I'm able to get down onto the snare and get the big backbeat using quite a lot of thumb, which eventually a snap of the wrist is going to give me that, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years, but we've got time. Okay, now we're going to assemble the drum kit for you and talk a little bit about how and why along the way. The first thing you want when you're assembling a drum kit is someone to do it for you. Here we have Larry Allen, who's been my drum tech for about 20 years now, on stage and in the studio, and he doesn't look too bad considering. And here we are with Mr. Bass Drum. One long-time frustration for me in the studio has been, as much as I love to play with the front bass drum head on, I love the response of it and even the sound, the variety that you can get from the response off the head with the pedal. So many engineers just have a difficult time thinking about that factor, and they might give it a cursory try a couple of times and then say, no, let's just go with the open bass drum. So this time, fortunately, working with Cliff, we had prepared in advance of doing all the demos that way and had plenty of illustrations that we could get a satisfactory sound with the front head on, and Cliff was willing to give it a try. So as we do live, we have a mic wired in right into the middle of bass drum, and then another one in front to capture the response off of it, and it worked out very nicely indeed. So when Larry and I got to the countryside for the pre-production of this record and started assembling what would be my new setup, I had certain things that I'd learned from Freddie and areas in which he'd encouraged me to make changes that I wanted to explore. So the first thing we did was just put the bass drum on the floor with the throne and started building from that one piece at a time. And part of it was moving myself a little farther away from the bass drum instead of my previous thoughts of wanting to be as much on top of things as I could be. Now I was aware of the freedom of motion and the circularity of motion that I wanted to encourage and have lots of room actually for that to happen rather than trying to cramp up all of the natural motions of the body. So I'm moving back a little bit and learned circular motion of my foot sliding around on the bass drum pedal now. And keeping things moving in between the beats. As I've stressed, so much happens. It was quite a lot lower, and I'd be playing down into the drum, and even through the drum would be my follow-through into the stroke. Through Freddie's urging, I kept raising it higher and higher, and my area of activity became a circle above the drum, so the end of my motion was the drum. The end of that circle where the beat took place was the bottom part of the orbit. So it came higher and higher until Freddie was satisfied, and I noticed it was right with my navel, the belly button that in Buddhist belief and Hindu belief is the center of the body's force, and as well as in physical fact, it's the center of gravity in the modern male body. So that became an important part of the motion. Everything takes place above the drum, circular motions between all of the drums, around on the feet also. Everything is a free and natural motion. And now we arrive at your basic 4-drum setup with a hi-hat and a couple of cymbals. That's certainly all you really need, and most of my practice setup at home would be made up pretty much of this. One of the things that drew me to DW, and one of the things I certainly look for in tom-toms especially, is the combination of resonance and response. It's easily demonstrated here that that note hangs on such that I found during the recording of this record, when I came to the end of a take where you would normally grab the cymbals to shut them up, I was actually trying to grab the toms too, because they would continue to resonate so long after the song was finished. So it's a reflection on the craftsmanship that goes into making them, that they have that kind of resonance and the response off the head that makes them so satisfying to play. enhanced basic drum set now. A couple more toms, a couple more cymbals, and interesting in the cymbals too, it's about the only thing that remains from a previous setup is Zildjian cymbals, which I've been with since I could first afford a decent cymbal, and but still the sound I like and the feel that I like and what I like to hear back in a playback too. One thing missing from the setup this time is electronics, and not through any reactionary bias against them, but simply, again, form and function, what the job calls for. I had an interesting experience on the previous record, Counterparts, where I conceived a whole setup for my back kit, which would include hand drums. I wanted to use congas and bongos, hand drums, and then be sitting down and have all kinds of foot triggers that could take over a complete timekeeping function and allow me to have a little percussion ensemble. But as the album came together and the songs were written, I discovered there were no songs in which such a setup would work, so I had to scrap that idea and ended up not using it. And I'm sure in live situations I'll continue to use the triggers because I love what they can do in terms of bringing the whole ensemble of percussion instruments into something that I can reach with 2 hands and 2 feet. So normally we would have pads and triggers and foot triggers and so on all over the place. But again, as we were working on this record, not only was I so focused on drum set playing from my own point of view and my personal agenda, but from the band's agenda and the song's agenda, they simply didn't require that kind of usage. And now we add a few more colors to the palette. A higher tom, a lower tom, some China cymbals, splash cymbals, a second hi-hat over here, a tiny little piccolo snare, cowbells and another splash over here, and another tom on my left to give left-hand access for different timekeeping or fill composition functions. Okay, the next thing we add is the microphones, so the audience can hear, or in this case, so the tape machine can hear. And in both situations, either in live situations or in the studio, is something I leave strictly up to the engineer as a professional. He knows what mics are going to work the best, and I don't have any knowledge of it and don't really wish to. I've got my own set of problems. But in each case, the only thing that matters, as long as they're not physically in my way, and as long as they're producing the sound that I want to hear in a way that the engineer is satisfied with, then that's all we ask. And finally, the drummer. All we need is a drummer to make it easy to move your feet. A few specialized bits of equipment here besides the sticks. From the top, we have the special hat soaking up sweat to keep it out of your eyes so you can see what you're hitting. Special bicycle racing helmet to hold the headphones in place, works well on stage or in the studio. Farther down, another piece of bicycle equipment. We have a lovely bicycle clip to hold the pants out of the way of the pedals, and dancing shoes. One of Freddie Gruber's few dogmatic dictums is don't play drums wearing sneakers. So I thought about that and got myself some nice slippery dancing shoes, and sure enough, they've changed it so much that I tried to play in sneakers lately and I could hardly do anything. So, dancing shoes. There are no straight lines in nature. That's one of the dictums of Professor Frederick Gruber, and I kind of think it's true. I thought about it a bit, as I usually tend to do with things like that, and I realized that anything in nature that does seem to be straight, like a beam of light, for instance, actually travels in waves. So it can be seen that everything is orbital and cyclical and circular, and so it should be in music, I think, especially in drumming, that you're not dealing with a series of points in a line, but rather a point in a circle. And one of the things that Freddie stresses in his playing is the motion between the beats. And he uses illustrations of dancers or piano players, and drumming too, where most of it does take place in the air, so it makes sense for you to think about what happens in the air between the notes, between the beats, as part of the orbital motion. So a lot of the exercises that Freddie gets me started working with were this sort of thing, to get my playing circular and to get a more efficient movement, so that when you're not having to work, when you're not having to exert force, you're not. And one of the things he stresses is, if the stick wants to fall, let it fall. And thumb control is a series of exercises also that he had me working on, have to do with just thumb control and always having effortless but complete control over that stick. So as it falls, I've trained my thumb now to be able to monitor the movement of that stick and let it fall but still control its falling. And part of that motion too, and another thing is with Freddie's idea is, the stick wants to bounce, let it bounce. And part of certainly my old way of playing had to do almost with playing right through the drum in the way that you're taught, for instance, with a golf swing, that you play through the ball. In a drum, you don't necessarily want to play right through the drum, I don't think, and aim for the floor. Really, I try to make now the end of my stroke becomes the surface of the drum. And if the stick wants to bounce, I've tried to learn to let it bounce and use that bounce, so that if I'm playing fills or rolls or time or whatever, the bounce becomes a part of my motion. So I'm monitoring that bounce and controlling it, but just letting it happen. Get out of the way is the way Freddie puts it. If the thing wants to happen, then don't prevent it from happening. Just use those physics of the drumstick falling or the drumstick bouncing. Use them to your advantage as part of the music, as part of the orbital motion of rhythmic play, and controlling what happens in the air between your beats. And it's a series of small exercises that would vary from drummer to drummer, so I can't really lay them out as a program, but they're exercises for the feet and hands, and indeed for the whole body, that contribute to feeling everything as a cycle of motion. One of the analogies that I like to use with Freddie is what he's been to me is more like what a pro tennis player has a coach for. They don't need a coach to teach them how to play the game. And as with drumming too, I've been playing for 30 years and in this band for more than 20, so I really know what I want to accomplish and a lot of the ways in which to go about it. But Freddie comes in and more or less watches my serve or watches my cross-court backhand and will suggest ways to make those more efficient, more comfortable, and in the case of drumming, it also ends up making it more musical, because if something is more effortless to play and more natural to play, naturally it changes the shape of the music. And this is a subtle change that at first blush might not even be recognizable. When I first started playing the new drum parts for this album to Geddy and Alex in the band, they didn't really notice a lot of difference. They thought maybe I had new hardware or something. So that's an indication of how subtle it is. Or when Peter Collins came in, our co-producer, and he heard the demos for the first time, and I told him the process I'd been through of studying with Freddie and practicing every day for the year prior to that point. And he said, well, it still sounds like you. And at first I was kind of taken aback by that, but then I had to realize, well, it's a compliment. If I can completely restructure everything I do about the way I play and the drums that I play it on and the way I set them up and the way I approach them and the way I hold the sticks and the end of the stick that I hold, the drum heads I used, everything nearly is different. If all of that can happen and it still sounds like me, then I think that's a vote of confidence that my approach to playing, my sense of how things should be orchestrated and placed, and my physical approach to drumming too, as being energetic and kind of forceful, all of that is going to come out also. So that's an element of the subtlety, and the other two guys in the band are a good example in that respect too. As I said early on, they thought they didn't hear much difference, but when it came time to play to my recorded drum parts and to overdub their parts to it, suddenly they did discover that they had to change their time sense. They had to alter their own clock to sit in with me, because there's a subtle little change of me playing the pulse now, instead of playing to the click track or playing to metrical points in a line time. Now that I'm playing to dots on a circle type of time, it changes in a subtle but very fundamental way the whole clock under which our music is built. And here we have another fine example of orbital motion.
Here we go, vertigo, video vertigo, test for echo. Here we go, in slow-mo, video vertigo, test for echo. Test for echo. Camera curves over cave talking hood boys in protein logo knockoffs, conform to uniforms of some corporate entity. Don't change that station, it's gangster nation. Now crimes and syndication on TV. What a show, vertigo, video vertigo, test for echo. Touch and go in slow-mo, video vertigo, test for echo. Test for echo.
Okay, this one being the opening track on the album and the title track, it stands to reason from Rush Habit anyway that it represents kind of an overture for all of the music that's presented. We want it to be the grand opening for everything. And because it has so many different parts and it spans a dynamic range from just ride cymbal and hi-hat all the way up to full double bass drum onslaught and a lot of steps in between. So I'm just going to outline a few of the steps and different ways they're treated through the song and different ways that small changes, such as moving the hi-hat from the downbeat to the upbeat, have changed it also. Just a word about the opening hi-hat figure. It would seem that it might have been derived from swing patterns and so on, but really it was just the result of a year's worth of practicing every day gave me the dexterity to be able to play those kind of intricate little rhythms. So it was a way to keep the rhythm kind of active, almost in a Latin sense, and yet keep the flow of it steady. Because when I first heard it, of course, it was just the moving guitar arpeggiated line with bass drum punches here and there. So that's really what I had to go on. So I wanted to give it a little more life, a little more vitality through the sparseness and the dynamically light section of ride cymbal and hi-hat. So I open with that and then follow the punches with the bass drum through the vocal section, and then it moves into the toms. And then that becomes a kind of dynamic high point in the construction of the song. So dynamically, this song follows a series of waves up and down, and actually the climax of the song comes after the first verse when the full double bass drum onslaught comes in. Then it comes back down and cruises through several levels again. Again, right back as sparsely drum part-wise as ride cymbal and hi-hat, and as busy as the whole double bass drum to second hi-hat to cymbals, tom-tom, snare, everything is in there all at once. So it's a really good example of how dynamic a drum part can be within one song. So the opening figure, I'll just walk through the opening stages here from the ride cymbal into the tom section. And an important thing to notice about the toms here, that when I'm up doing the patterns on the toms and the snare, they follow the melodic flow. And this wasn't consciously thought of by me, but certainly I recognize it afterwards that I was subconsciously responding to the rhythmic movement, the modulation of guitar and bass parts through that riff, and trying to make the drum parts melodically through the toms mirror that, or at least empathize with it a little bit. And then the verse opens up with just straight halftime feel, and then there's an interesting thing that happens. I wanted to take it up one step halfway through the verse, but not yet go to full time. So there was a little figure from a song called Mercy, 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 which we did on the Buddy Rich tribute. It was a tune of Buddy's, and Dave Weckl recorded it on there and did his interpretation of Buddy's rhythm from the original. And I liked that little rhythm and started playing with it in my practicing sessions every day, so that when we came to working on this record and I needed something a little special in between two stages, I pulled that thing out of the toolbox and added that in there, and then it builds up to a full double bass drum onslaught. So I'll just walk through an abbreviated version of each of those steps right up to what really represents the dynamic climax of the song, and thus you'll be able to see demonstrated really. From there, it progresses into the second verse. Same sort of thing. Interesting with the cymbal fill there. It's a thing that I think only experience can bring you, and it's reflected in the drum break that I do later on in the tune, a 7-beat break, in which I do the same sort of free time thing on the snare drum, and then keep the time moving with a double bass drum triplet, and then run down the toms. Interesting thing to note, too, in the double bass drum part is that there's a dropped beat in there. And this is the kind of thing that Geddy and Alex often do without counting it or thinking of it. Let's put in an odd beat or something. They just instinctively drop things to make a change. And then as drummer, of course, I have to find a way to go along with them. We can also note that the second time the ride cymbal and hi-hat, the lowest dynamic level, the next time it comes around, I actually move the hi-hat foot to the upbeat of it, which gives it a swing pattern feel, but then you're dealing with arpeggiated guitar and bass firmly rooted in downbeats as rock is, so there's no sense of feeling a swing rhythm behind it, which I really like because it makes it a little bit obscure. And then when I do move off to the tom-toms again, as I did in the opening, suddenly now the foot hi-hat is on the upbeat and it changes the feel. And remarkably, even on the record through everything else, you can hear the foot hi-hat going, which one reason I give engineer Cliff Norrell and the mixing engineer Andy Wallace a lot of credit for managing to accomplish something like that. those kind of variations. Another good thing to notice there is that tom rhythm is built around paradiddles. Kind of thing you start out from the very beginning of playing is learning your rudiments. It becomes a tool in the toolbox so that when you come to address something like this, you can say, well, what would allow me to follow the guitar and bass riffs up and down? Paradiddles is the thing. So having worked on that all my life, I have the paradiddles to pull out and use for that purpose. Really, you could say that it all begins in a place much like this, sitting around in the woods, thinking about drumming or thinking about the other hat that I wear, lyric writing. One writer once said that the hardest thing for a writer's wife to learn is that when he's staring out the window, he's working. And one of my favorite subjects, certainly lyrically, has been human nature, the way people behave and perhaps why. And some weeks before we start the pre-production process of writing, I'll make sure to go off to my little place in the woods and try to get some of these things on paper and try to get a start so that on day one I don't have to face that dreaded blank page syndrome. So I'll put together maybe 3 or 4 ideas in sketch form so that on day one I can give some lyrics to the other guys to start working. And they have the place that we do our pre-production work. They have a small studio at one end of the house where they can work on musical ideas. And I continue wearing my lyric writing hat in a small room at the other end of the house and gradually passing things back and forth as the other guys get musical ideas that perhaps I can tailor some words to fit, or I keep passing them lyrical ideas as I complete a first draft of them, and they try to see if they have pieces of music underway that might suit those. This time we took a little different tack. In the past we would try to write the pieces of a song and then spend the time to put together the details of arrangement. And this time Geddy and Alex found it a more enjoyable way to work, really, to just put the pieces together and then put them aside and do the tedium of the assembly and arranging later. So the pieces were going back and forth to the songs, and they were gradually coming together, and I would start working on drum parts. The other guys generally would give me a demo tape of a song in a rough arrangement that we had discussed. We'd sit down and listen to it and discuss the arrangement and move this part there, shorten this part, make that part longer, reintroduce this section again later as an echo, or foreshadow it with this part. And all the small details of arrangement are talked about, really. Again, we've worked together for 20 years, so we can talk about something for a long time without playing it and really come close to the final result of how it would be. So once I had this demo tape with just a drum machine on it, it pretty much represents a blank slate for me. So I would go in at night often when they would let me have the studio and play along with the demo tape, basically try everything I thought might work and then eliminate the impossible rather than starting simple and gradually adding details. I much prefer to throw everything at it that I think might stick and then, like I said, eliminate the things that patently aren't suitable. So then I would gradually refine down a sketch of a drum part that I was thinking of and pass it along to those guys, collect their comments on it. Perhaps Geddy would overdub a new bass part to my drum part that would be more sympathetic. And what we have in this process is a kind of a slow improvisation, where in years past it would be all of us in the studio at once, trying to learn the song, trying to arrange the song, trying to listen to each other's parts and respond to them, incorporate them into our parts, inspire the inspiration of our part into other people's playing, and all of that process going at once in a welter of confusion, really. And it promotes a lot of anxiety working under those conditions too, because you always think it's taking you too long to learn the song or work out your part, and if you're playing it over and over again, it's all your fault. So lately, in the last 3 or 4 records, I would say we've evolved the process of working together separately, so that I'll work on the drum part, pass it over, Geddy makes changes, I respond to those changes, make a new drum part that responds to that, and there's this constant interplay going on, is the word that I like, because we are playing, and we're playing together, but we're adding it in a very logical and very efficient manner that allows all the joys of working together as an ensemble, which is something that, of course, we really enjoy, and I would have no desire to work in any other context but in a truly democratic band. Well, actually, we're not so much of a democracy because it's not a majority rule situation. Everyone has to like it. So it's another aspect that reflects on the arrangement of the music and, of course, each individual part, that it has to please not just 2 out of 3 or 1 out of 3, but 3 out of 3 in our case, that we want everybody to be satisfied with it. So this process proceeds right up really to when we get to the recording stage. This demo has been passed back and forth and been re-recorded over with refreshed drum parts and then new bass parts, new guitar parts, new vocal arrangements, experiments that everybody wants to make in overdubs. If Geddy has ideas for vocal harmonies or things like that, they'll all be tried on the demo tape. And when it comes to the serious recording here in Bearsville, where we came to record the drums, that demo tape now becomes our guide. And again, I'll go into the studio by myself and record to that, but this is a tape that's been made as an ensemble in this collective slow improv method, and thus my drum part is completely sympathetic and responsive to what the other guys will be playing, and to the song, and to the time structure and the dynamics. Everything is there. I'm not just out there playing solo drums, of course. I'm playing the drum part for a song, as I've carefully orchestrated it and rehearsed it over weeks and weeks of all this research and development. So in that day, when the day of serious recording comes, for one thing, the concentration level hikes up a notch, which is another reason I really like it. It's quite fashionable now for people to record at home or in their rehearsal rooms. I know a lot of bands do it that way. But for me, I really like the serious focus on the moment that comes. Here we are in the recording studio. It's time to record the record. I find that pressure drives me to a new level that wouldn't be possible under other circumstances. So here we are in the studio on day one. You'll have the whole production team in there focused on one performance. All the guys we brought in to do the recording work on this, everyone's focused on the drum part, getting the sound right, and then the performance. Every element of it is microscopically examined, which isn't always a pleasure when you're in the hot seat, but at the same time it ensures that you get the best performance under the best conditions possible. And then subsequently, as it goes along, then once all the drum parts are recorded, then you move into the bass part under the same parameters, where everyone's focusing their attention on the bass performance and on the bass sound and how it relates to the sound and the dynamics, and the rhythm interlocks with my drum part. And I'll be in there with him, with Getty, helping him out with what I'm doing and why, and how he might interact to it, or if he should or not. Sometimes, of course, we just stay out of each other's way. And then ultimately, when all is recorded and it comes to the mix, then everybody is in there commenting on it, with the mixing engineer putting together his vision of the overall performance, and then each of us, of course, making comments on the drum should be louder and other relevant things like that.
Of what is right. Take it easy on me now, I'd be there if I could. I'm so full of what is right, I can't see what is good. It's a hopeless situation. Lie awake for half the night. You're not sure what's going on here, but you're sure it isn't right. Make it easy on yourself. There's nothing more you can do. You're so full of what is right, you can't see what is true. Equality of justice, equality of life. If
Again, this is a song made up of a lot of fairly simple parts, but they're very carefully selected and carefully orchestrated for a song like this where the feel is paramount. Again, in the sense of serving the song, that I was very conscious of the type of song it was, introducing some level of sensitivity, but also not wanting to short myself in terms of making it interesting or challenging. So all of these things come into play in serving the necessary agenda of getting the job done here. A nice example is the punches off the top. Getty had introduced the pushes on the original demo tape of just bass punctuations around the cyclical guitar part. And then when I came time to add my bit to it, I felt compelled to add a couple of more little bits of juice. And then when it came back to me again with Getty's response to that and adding those, suddenly I found it really difficult to play. It's easy enough to invent it and throw it in, but when it comes back into a musical context, it was the very conclusion of that opening part was hard to get exactly in the right places, those syncopations, once they became a musical part as opposed to just a rhythmic variation. And throughout the song, I've woven in combinations of side stick and loose time on the hi-hat, and then the chorus is coming into quite a driving approach rhythmically. Again, we're playing with elasticity of time a little bit. I wanted the verses to feel quite relaxed, but the choruses, on the other hand, to be a little more urgent, and especially when it comes into the instrumental with the little eighth note pushes and so on, there's a sense of urgency about that. And then it was necessary, of course, to halt that urgency and bring it back down to the more relaxed feel of the verse and bridge feels. One way in which I accomplished that transition, because it's easier to pick up the intensity, of course, than it is to draw it back and still make it comfortable for the listener and not make it feel as if it slowed down, which is, of course, okay. So there's a little fill that I've used at the end of the instrumental section, which kind of hangs suspended through a couple of movements and then draws to a conclusion down to the lower tom and returns to the looser time. So I'm just going to demonstrate that with a little bit of setup of where it's coming from, and then you'll hear how that fill just kind of hangs the time for a moment, leaves it suspended, but there's a lift going on at the same time because there's more action. And again, a relatively simple fill, but the placement is so critical, and it took me a lot of work to make sure this had to feel a certain way, and it had to hang suspended in a certain way, conclude in a certain way to come back to that time and still all feel totally smooth. That's an example of something we'll be coming back to later, how hard-won simplicity can be. So I'll just play through that selection of changes for you. And another example of fill that I used in this tune for a different purpose, at the end of the song, after it's been winding out and the urgency that I mentioned has been building up through the ride out, other instruments have been added to the orchestration, a high harmony guitar and so on, to gradually increase the orchestration for the sake of increasing the intensity. So the time feel remains the same with a little bit more spark of urgency from me, just pushing it along a little more. And then when it came to the ending, I wanted to just take it up that little level higher. So I thought, again, go back to the triplet feel is always a really good way to do that. And I had a melodic approach of something I'd been working on that used snare to the toms, and then around the toms, again, a concluding note. This brings up an interesting question that a young engineer once asked me in all naivety, but it's one of the kinds of questions that when you get hit with after 30 years of playing the instrument, he simply asked me, why do drum fills always go down? Why do they always descend? And I had to think about that for a while, and then I realized, well, drumming, like all music, comes out of conversation. And when you want to make an emphatic statement, your voice descends. You go down, because that's an emphatic exclamatory remark. Whereas if you're asking a question, your voice rises. Or if you're telling a joke, sometimes you'll use upward modulation because it has a lighter, more frivolous or interrogative aspect to it. So if you think of drumming in those terms, in terms of conversational, when you're making a statement or trying to make something emphatic, it's bound to descend because that's the way the human voice goes when it's making a particular statement. So here's that fill as it appears at the end of the track. I'm just breaking that down a little bit slowly. Again, made up of simple elements, but the right thing at the right time, of course, is what makes the choice and what makes the selection of all these parts important. So simply based, it's around 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, here we have the arsenal of snare drums that accompanies me to the studio, and the reason for having so many of them was well brought home to me on this project. I'd worked in 2 rooms before coming here to Bearsville during the rehearsals and pre-production, and I'd been trying different snare drums for the different tunes and kind of making notes of what I liked the best. And in each case, every time I changed rooms, that choice of snare drums altered considerably. And when I got here, it changed again, that certain drums worked out to be more suitable for this room and its particular acoustic character. So one of the ones that got used the most on this is one of the new DW ones that I have, which is one of the solid maple, and just had the right sort of brightness and attack and everything that this room required. Although it hadn't worked quite so well in other rooms, it just happened to really suit this room and got used, I guess, on about 7 of the 11 tracks. One of my favorites of these to play on is its neighbor here. We call it the Fat Boy, and it weighs about 4,700 pounds. It's a combination of solid brass in the shell area with a solid wood section in the middle, so you get both the attack and the brightness of a metal drum, but at the same time the warmth and the tonality of a wooden drum. And this one too, the response of it makes it a beautiful thing to play on. It's one of my favorites just to be playing for purity of its response and of its sound. It'll be noticed also that nearly all of these snares that I brought to choose from are new ones, which many people tend to prize the vintage drums, but for my money, I think things just keep getting better in drum world, and especially with the level of craftsmanship that a company like DW brings to their product. The tradition of drum making is still alive there, but the innovations and the care that they've brought to it have made what to me is a finer instrument than any of the old ones have been. I still do hang on to my old favorite, number 1 we call it, which is my old Slingerland wooden one, which I picked up secondhand probably nearly 20 years ago. And I prize it for its versatility, really. A lot of times in the studio, it won't be as specialized as other ones in terms of having a certain sensitivity or a certain power or a certain crack that I might be looking for. But I always find one in the live show where I want to use one snare drum to cover everything. Up to this point, anyway, it's been the one that will do everything readily. It's so versatile in that respect. So the choices then are dictated largely by the room. And as I was saying, that sometimes I'll make my choices in the room that I'm rehearsing in. Then when you actually get in the studio, you find that the room requires a certain different drum. So that's why I need to have quite an arsenal, and also to have tested them previously through the whole pre-production. I'll try a different snare drum really every night that I'm working on the demos, and then make a note to myself of what that drum does, how it comes across through the microphones, and how it affects the song that I'm using it in. So all of that's logged all the way along, but still with the understanding that when it comes to the final recording, that will dictate which snare drum needs to be chosen. So consequently, my whole family of favorites at the time, which of course that changes every project also, but this is my family of favorites now that I wanted to have to choose from, which spans a spectrum of dark and bright and sensitive and loud. And thus when I need to make a small change and I'll go in for a playback and they'll say, well, I think the snare drum could have a little more crack or a little more depth or whatever, I'll know exactly which one offers that little percentage point of change in the direction that's required for the song. Hence the choice. In other words, the form that you give the drum part for a song is going to reflect the function that you want it to attain. In my case, I'm given a demo of a song such as this one, Dog Ears, and there's a whole list of problems to be solved. It's a little metaphor I got from rock climbing I thought was really interesting. When you're hanging somewhere on a cliff, the next move you make is a problem to be solved, and you're trying to attain a next set of goals and a next set of goals, and they're all interlinked. The construction of a song can be like that too. You have choices rhythmically and tempo-wise to push and pull the tempo here, to accompany the band here, to drive the band there, to lay back into a steady groove here. All these things become a part of your orchestration and the elements that you're going to juggle in terms of the form of your drum part. So what's the job to be done? This one opens up with a double time section, of course, where you're driving. You're going to drive that band. And then when it comes down into the verse sections, you want it just to groove along as an accompaniment. And then there are returns of the double time section throughout the song. Choruses where you want to be driving and pushing the band along. And then elements like the ride out that we'll discuss, where I'm just trying to lay down a steady groove that planes out for a while and then builds up once more to the acceleration of a double time section that's going to drive the band in through to the conclusion. The choruses I played across the bar line and treated, actually, I suppose, beat 3 as the downbeat. And the reason for that is pretty simple, is because that's where the singing started. So I decided, well, that's the essence of the chorus, is where the singing starts, so I'll treat that as my downbeat. And in some places I play my fill right past the downbeat and into where the dog ears vocal comes in, and treated that as the downbeat. Other places my cymbal figures, and thus they influenced Alex's slide guitar figures. He also plays over the bar line with the same sort of triplet feels and syncopations that I've used on the cymbal patterns, to cross over that bar line for the same reason. And it's just a kind of thing that you might think was a musical decision or a drummer's wish to stretch the parameters, but in fact it was entirely dictated not just by the structure of the song, by what the singer was doing.
or a span of geological time. I'd rather be a tortoise from Galapagos or a span of geological time and be living in these dog years, living in these dog years.
So that you can see, as I outlined in the preamble, this song really represents a good example of controlling the time and sometimes choosing to drive the band along, sometimes choosing just to accompany the band, sometimes choosing to pull the time back a little bit, push it forward, whatever's required for a certain part, and in context of the whole song, because you want the certain breathing aspect of it and certain parts of it to have a different effect on the listener in that way. So there are certain things that I've used in this song too, and little tricks that have both an interesting source and some interesting history along with the way they've developed. Again, referring back to the Burning for Buddy sessions, a thing that I noticed Steve Gadd do in his fill that he used in Love for Sale that kind of struck me, and that was this. So I thought that was pretty cool, and when I was practicing along with other things, I started using that and found that I could route it to the hi-hat and place it in different areas around a rhythm. So having that in the toolbox, I had the double time section opening up here, and I needed a little punctuation. Halfway through it, I wanted one piece of punctuation that expressed continuity. I wanted another little punctuation that had a finality of it, because I'm moving on now to the verse feel, in which I'm just trying to set up a groove really that just flows smoothly along and brings us up to the next section without any real dynamic change. So the way in which I've used those figures there for both of those reasons, the first time it appears with a China symbol and becomes a comma, as it were, in terms of punctuation, that there's still more of the sentence to come, and then at the end of it you'll hear the finality of the snare flam and then on to the verse rhythm. So the song starts in the double time such. So on through the verse. So it's just an example. You'll hear this in different places throughout the record. Every case it's always rooted to the tom-tom rather than just being a rough that's put in to interrupt things. In every case I always wanted some kind of descending punctuation, but with some continuity to flow along with it. So that's the genesis of how that developed, the influence of Steve Gadd, and then my own experiments in finding variations with it. And then once the opportunity to use it came along, having the choice of using one example with continuity and another example with finality. Another common thread that runs rhythmically through a lot of the fills and different patterns that I've used is variations on the triplets. Again, things that are the result of experimenting by practicing every day and that I ran across. And first I got interested in it in the way that I could have a triplet feel moving across downbeat quarter note time. And then I started playing with different variations of it around different areas, and some of which I've used in this song, some of which in other songs. But it really comes from this originally. So the way I came up with another variation in this, and something that is a little bit jagged and angular. So I had to choose a place to use something like this where it wouldn't interfere with anything else going on. So there happened to be a transition in this song going into the second verse, and then again going into the middle eight section, where there was just a steady kind of sustain going on, and I found it didn't interrupt the flow. To the contrary, it spiced it up and enlivened the rhythm, leading me on to the next part. So the variation that I used in this goes ride cymbal and then to snare drum and bass drum. It's the way that the 2-bar measure of it leads into the downbeat of the solo. Other variations that I've used in other songs I use the hi-hat sometimes. Or again, the one that I demonstrated. All these variations were open because I'd worked on that in my practicing and figured out how to put that triplet feel right across the bar line and still keep it rooted to the hi-hat and still keep it rooted to the overall pulse of the tune. Another good thing to address is a temperamental problem of my own, that I hate to do the same thing twice, but sometimes in the same song you have the same job that needs to be done twice. So what I'll try to do is accomplish the same thing with a slight little variation so that it keeps me entertained and also on my toes in terms of both performance and the imagination that it takes to keep coming up with these variations. I have a couple times through this song where double time returns again, and I don't find it very satisfying to just cut from straight time to double time. It sounds to me just not very smooth and not very professional. So I found I could do a triplet feel pickup on the snare drum that would take me back to the double time, and I do it the first time just with snare and bass drum, and then the second time around introduce the double bass drum just to give it a little spark. So I'll be playing the straight time and then go through that transition in both of its variation. 2, 3, 4. So I'm coming off the double time, and then I'll try to break this down slowly. Just for the elements that it is, it's basically keeping the downbeat going with my right hand on the toms, and then letting the two bass drums play the triplet part, and then coming back to the flam on the snare again for the finality to make that transition as a sharp one, but smooth as I can. The second time that same transition appears, I've again allowed myself the indulgence of giving a little variety into it by introducing the two bass drums for that. So I'll just that I use and then on into the double time. So these are ways in which you can keep yourself amused, keep the rhythmic side of things interesting, but without ever interrupting the flow or intruding upon a vocal part or anybody else's solo part or any place where you don't belong. In this song also we have another example of problem solving that can be aided by having a selection of tricks in your toolbox that you can pull out when you need them. There's a variation I do just in the ride-out section of Dog Ears, which is based around the verse feel, the two-handed hi-hat part with the downbeat on the right hand, only I move this one over to the second hi-hat here and keep the left hand going on my left hi-hat with the foot syncopations and chokes and so on in between it for spice and variety. And somehow just the movement of going back and forth between the second hi-hat to here gives it a whole steadier, more settled feel, which is exactly what I needed for that ride-out section before it built up again into the double time for the big finale. So I'll just demonstrate a little bit of the verse feel and then move into that ride-out feel and show you how there is a subtle different feeling introduced just by moving one hand to a different place. When preparation meets opportunity. The phrase really refers to luck, as in luck is when preparation meets opportunity. Certainly it applies to music and definitely to drumming in this case, the preparation being the things that you learn and the amount of practicing you do to get smooth at them, to explore new ideas, and also to have things in the old toolbox for when you get an idea for something that requires a swing part or a Latin part or a disco part or an African drum beat or something. I can think of times in the past where I've explored things just out of curiosity or for entertainment value in my practicing and worked on those things and then suddenly found that I could use a Nigerian dance beat in a song like Territories or used a West African pop beat in the instrumental section of Superconductor, for instance. Various things like this come into play And a song like Virtuality, the one we address here, not an extreme example, but it still goes through several changes of heavy rock riff and then the driving straight ahead rock rhythms, and then the breakdown sections of eccentric little bass drum hi-hat cowbell figures, and into the middle section with an out-and-out disco beat. So these are things that, as a problem-solving device, first of all, I had to decide what parts do I need, and then, of course, you hope that you're able to do them once you dream them up. And that's where the practicing can come into play, where you just develop new ideas and put them away in the toolbox, and someday they'll come out, and someday you'll need them, and you go, gee, I'm glad I worked on that. When preparation meets opportunity. Well, if good luck is where preparation meets opportunity, I guess good music is where preparation meets opportunity also. And for a song like this, I was called upon to bring out a whole different set of bag of tricks for different parts, dealing from heavy riff-driven rock with a quarter note feel on open sloshy hi-hat to other figures, the choruses that are quite standard pop rock sort of propellant figures. And then in the dissonant sections of the B sections of the verses, I come down to just hi-hat and bass drum, spiced in with cowbells and strange parade drum effects on a little 12-inch effects snare here. Cowbells are something I've used for many, many years as a solo device, as a way to introduce a note of levity. Humor, what a concept. To introduce a bit of humor and also a bit of melody into drum solo work, and I've used it also in double sections in different songs of ours throughout time, and it's a kind of a little signature of mine, and I really do like using them for that. And this part being essentially a goofy part in its harmonic structure and also in its presence in the song, then I felt it's time to bring out those kind of little things, strange sounding goofy cowbells and little bizarre parade drum figures seemingly out of nowhere. And another thing that comes upon the conceptual side of things in this song is the middle section is talking about Let's Dance Tonight to a Virtual Song. And this whole song is really meant to be taken with a note of irony rather than being literally taken, as it's a bit of a parody on the whole inter-thing generation. So I was, when I was writing the lyrics to this, thinking about Let's Dance Tonight to a Virtual Song. It sounds nice and romantic, but really what's a virtual song and who would want to dance to it? So I wanted to point that out by putting in really a disco beat behind that with a little syncopated hi-hat and 4 on the floor bass drum, and just right out of the dance drum machine songbook, and bring that out hopefully to point up a little bit of irony. Other subtle ways you can respond to lyrical ideas and phrasings in that too. At the end of each of the verses, the lyrics fall in a phrasing punctuated on the 1 and on the 3, and I build those throughout the song. Each time they come, first I just state them at bass drum and ride cymbal as I'm playing through the time, and then I gradually introduce other figures till I work up towards the end where it becomes kind of the big culmination of all of those little hints and foreshadowings. And that figure I can break down a little bit because it's made up of some interesting parts. Again, just based on a 1 and 3 triplet feel across the time that's been building up throughout with just simple snare figures and simple punctuations with bass drum and so on. And then when it finally gets to that last time, I play through the last chorus, give it more drive too, building up that last one, even taking advantage of a mistake. I'll tell you about the mistakes I like. Since most of this record was made in 1 or 2 takes, 3 at most, things that crept in that I've become comfortable enough with my playing, particularly now getting looser and more comfortable with the rhythmic flow of things, that if something unexpected happens or even mistaken happens, it will still be in the context of time because I've developed that kind of fluidity that even a mistake is going to fall in the right place. So there was an example here where I was coming into the final chorus, and I just had it in my mind that I was going back to the heavy riff section with the quarter note hi-hat. So as it happens, the first 2 coming into that chorus, I landed on that hi-hat, but I liked it. You know, it really works. It gives that chorus an extra bit of propulsion and builds it up. And when the vocals are finished, and all of us just dig into that part like crazy, and where it's been quite a light acoustic-driven part, the chorus of the song throughout, that last time around, everyone's just digging into it and giving it all they have, and that's the point at which we arrive at the big fill. So I'm about to get to that. Another thing that happens in this song that we've alluded to before, and I've used it in a slightly different way here, is again the double bass drum triplets, only this time they tend to be rising up to meet a beat. And something I'll introduce in a reprise of the riff section. Again, the riff sections appear quite frequently throughout the song, so I tried to treat them differently in my transitions out of them usually, and in some way give them a spark of freshness while never losing the hard quarter note drive for them. And also in the breakdown section in the middle of the instrumental, there's a part where everybody just comes to a pause and there's echo on the bass and guitar, and then I come back in again with a rising double bass drum triplet back into the time again. So that's something that's used throughout, that time rising to the toms, another time rising to the snare and cymbal. I'll just play a bit of that riff as it rides out through, and a couple of ways in which I've done that. Okay, another choice is reflected here too. When I'm dealing with the heavy riff sections, I'm over here on number 2 hi-hat, just leaving it open and only hitting it on the quarter notes, but keeping my time roll fluid,
by alternating between the ride cymbal and the hi-hat. Then when I come to the vocal verses, I come back over to my foot hi-hat, so I have better control of it, and also I'm not just stressing the quarter notes now. I'm keeping the time more fluid along with the eights, and then every time we come back to the riff section or through that ride-out section that I mentioned previously, lean on the quarters and let that riff-driven piece just have as much weight as you can possibly give it. The bass drum, as you've just heard too, is quite active through that too, mimicking the movement of guitar and bass through the riff. So I'm just going to play through that last ride-out of the final chorus and then leading up to the big fill, which again falls on the same accents drawn from the vocal phrasing, and that's an important element of it too. It's drawn out of pieces of the song that I've chosen to first hint at and then start using more and more forcefully until the end. It becomes a very bombastic, unsubtle approach to it. But by the end of a song, I think we're allowed that kind of luxury. So here we go, ride out. Okay, so here we are in what we call the breakdown section, where I bring everything purposefully to a very jagged, sharp stop. And I'll just play the preceding bar to set up where that stop comes, and then bring the time back in, as I discussed, with the rising double bass drum triplet to the toms, and then off into the heavy riff-driven time again. So... couple more examples of how I've chosen to mimic something out of the lyrics, or just maybe even play a little pun on it in the choruses when the line comes back around about letting things go around the world. I use a little single stroke roll. As I've just discussed before, something I worked on a lot last year was getting my floating single stroke going so that I can play it pretty much out of time and just let it float over the time and then come in. I've just been like that, and it's like a cartoon character you would see, where just before just before the bunny takes off for the woods, you hear the... And it has that effect of go around the world, boom. And then in the final chorus, I've used it where go around the world, and then I literally go around the world, around the snare and the toms. So I'm just going to play a little passage of that chorus, also illustrating one other thing that I've been using a lot lately, is a little triplet on the ride pattern, which is not there really as a decoration or as a part of my my rhythmic part, and not even really to be noticed by the listener, but it's just something that really helps keep the time lilting. So I'm using it to keep the pulse going whenever I'm playing something linear on the ride cymbal, in a medium tempo especially, will affect on the time as it goes along. So I'll just illustrate those three things in passing, even without the lyrics, just be it understood that that was my inspiration for using those kind of figures, and again, nice to have them in the toolbox, so when the opportunity came along, I was prepared. So here we go. Now, the difference is often when I use a double bass drum triplet as a rising figure, either coming up to a flam or a snare drum and cymbal, or as in this case to the two toms, it often is a full triplet where I'm playing all three beats on the bass drum, rising up to a serious downbeat on the toms or whatever I happen to be using. So I'm going to endeavor to play these slowly, as often the case. A lot of things are more difficult to play slowly than they are at normal or fast speed, but what these amount to really is a triplet down below and a flam up above.
It takes a long time to get good time. For most young drummers, the biggest struggle is to develop some kind of continuity in your time sense, so that every time you do a fill, you're not speeding up or slowing down, and learning how to control your transitions. And one of the things that modern drummers have faced as a difficulty is working with click tracks and sequencers, which can give you metronomically, mathematically perfect time, but often at the expense of a bit of stiffness. So another trick that you learn along the way is how to control that time, how to control the metronome and push and pull it as much as you can and get some kind of fluidity into it. And Professor Gruber, my teacher, has an interesting story of his days in the late 40s playing in the dance halls in Manhattan. And he'd go in and the band leader would, give him the time of the song and say, "Okay, Freddie, lay it down." He'd go, and give him the time like this. So Freddie would do it, and it'd be for dancing, and there'd be people in gowns. And after hours, he'd go up to Harlem and sit in the after-hours clubs and be playing. And he'd start to put down the tempo, and he'd start to give the time like that. And the people would say, "No, no, no, Freddie, get up off of it," would be the alternate way of thinking of it, taking the time sense away from being metrical, away from being dots in a line, into being a pulse and a living, breathing time sense and a feel. And this is something that growing up, I thought, okay, once I got a perfect sense of time and that I could play along with click tracks and play along with sequencers, that was some kind of a goal conquered. And yet then no sooner did I start to achieve that kind of perfection than a stiffness started to creep into it and really annoy me that I was getting perfection at the expense of feeling relaxed and fluid. And this was a thing that I thought had to be innate. And when I heard other musicians, other drummers especially, having this kind of fluid time, I thought that's something that you're born with. And but one of the revelations that I had through studying with Freddie is that it can indeed be taught and learned just by learning to feel a pulse of time, not metrical divisions of the line, but points in the circle, orbital time. And all of that helped to contribute to the new time sense that I've been able to bring to this. And there's an interesting character in American history named Wild Bill Donovan, who founded the predecessor of the CIA, was OSS. And he had a great little saying that the perfect is the enemy of the good. And I think that really applies here, because developing perfect time sense, as I've described, can often lead to a kind of stiffness that doesn't really feel good. It may be right, but it's not right. Or it may be right, but it's not good. So I think that's very true, that achieving perfection for many drummers has been a difficult chore, because along the way we've had to sacrifice the natural, organic nature of music, breathing and speeding and slowing down in an innate sense that's an elasticity of time. And even when you're playing to a click track with a certain amount of experience in that, you can learn to push and pull that click track and pull the beat way back and drive it forward as a choice, not as a consequence of playing something that makes you speed up, but knowing that there's a segment of the music that you want to feel relaxed and another part of it that you want to feel tense and driving, and you purposely push the time even within those mathematical parameters to do that. And if I've decided that I have to push the time a little bit in a verse, pull it back in the chorus, all these things are subtleties of feel that again are learned on the concert stage over years and years. That in past years I usually get a live performance of the previous night's show, and I'll listen to it on a day off and make little mental notes of where I hear myself going a little wrong, speeding up or slowing down, or if I pulled back the tempo of a song it would make the vocals sit better. Those kind of subtleties that I can clock during the course of a tour, and I'll go on stage the next night with those things in mind and try to play them in, and then record it that night, listen to it the next day, and hear the differences, hear the improvements that I'm able to make on those levels. So that's again the product of experience, that when I go in to record a song, I know those kind of things that I'm going for, where I'm trying to pull the time around, where I'm trying to make it dynamically push and pull or breathe upward or downward. Those are all givens, musical givens in my mind, for the sake of the song, obviously, not for the sake of
While half gets on with it anyway.
Now this one for me, ironically, although it's deceptively simple on the surface, was actually quite difficult to get the right feel for it because it is relatively slow even for a medium tempo song. And every time I was going through it in the first days of trying to work out a drum part, sitting in the rehearsal studio, night after night when I was allowed to get in there and playing through this song, it was always like I wanted to go in there and speed up the demo and speed up the click track because it was just too darn slow. So I knew in the verses I wanted that good grinding feel with the loose hi-hat that I have, and then as it comes around into the chorus, I've used the triplet feel on the bell and a more linear approach, I guess you'd say, to driving the beat along. And then in the middle section of it, using a more syncopated, more rhythmic part, but still trying to get propulsion into it, where the verses have that grinding propulsion of their own, so I could stay back on the beat and not interfere with the forward motion, and reintroduce that forward motion in the alternating sections. That was an example of, again, a problem-solving thing that can drive like a song after a while. And now we're going to play the song I hate, was the way I would tend to put it. There's another interesting variation I've done here. We were speaking earlier about double bass drum triplets, using them with tom combinations. In this, a cat feel, and I've used a double bass drum triplet in that, just in the most subtle way, and tried to get it as smooth as I could so it wouldn't feel like I was shifting the time. So I'm just going to play a little bit of the time and then play the double bass drum figure that I used with the second hi-hat to bring in the vocals again without intruding on things, but allowing me to add some spice to it. Okay, we have another transition in this that I needed to work out something special for, where after the middle part where I'm playing the kind of syncopated bass drum parts along with the bass guitar, it moves into a double time section that's kind of the crescendo of the bridge, and then it comes to a stop. And what I've used there is a little double bass drum roll with cymbals on top of it to give an element of finality, but also a rolling quality to it, so it just didn't come to a dead halt, but kind of rolled off into a suspension is what I wanted, rather than a pause. So not a period, but more of an ellipse, a series of dots, so it would just hang suspended for a minute and then returns to the time. So just playing out of the double time section, and then the way that double bass drum phrase sits on the end of it. 2, 3, 4. Now, through the construction of this song, usually when it comes to the end of the verse and then chorus cycle, it stops on a pause and hangs suspended for a minute before returning to the time. The very last time around, it doesn't. It keeps going and carries on to a ride-out with a slight repeat chorus. So again, I wanted a piece of spice that would it would seem to halt, and I would play the same triplet feel across the cymbals that is designed to accompany the vocal phrasing. And then I used a triplet feel type of fill that gives it a sense of acceleration. And then as I come back into the ride cymbal groove and play out through the ride out, it doesn't interrupt the time, but kind of gives it a lift for a moment so that the listener gets hopefully a little surge of the adrenaline that the drummer feels when he's playing a passage like that. So I'll just play the setup for that fill, and then how the fill comes out into the steady time of the ride out once more.
Here we go, vertigo, video vertigo, test for echo. Here we go, in slow-mo, video vertigo, test for echo. Test for echo. Sensory screen, camera curves over caved-in cop cars. plausible deniability. Don't touch that dial. We're in denial until the showcase trial on TV. Here we go. Vertigo. Video. Vertigo. Test for echo. Some kind of pictures on the sensor clock news. Miles of yellow tape, silhouetted chalk lines. Tough talking hood boys in protein logo knockoffs. Conform to uniforms of some corporate entity. Don't change that station. It's gangster nation. Now crimes and syndication on TV. What a show. Vertigo. Video vertigo. Test for echo. Touch and go in slow-mo. Video vertigo. Test for echo.
Got a bug on the lens. There's a bug on the lens.
There is that.
No? Oh, maybe it's off here. Yeah, okay.
Test for echo.
So all of that, then it's transferred to the bass guitar, and Geddy then overdubs a bass part to me, but that bass part has largely been mapped out, again, through that interchange, that interplay of tapes that we've been going through for really several months. Ouch!
Good is in the details. That's my take on, an atheistic take on a phrase, God is in the details, coined by the German writer Goethe, and then later echoed by a so-called minimalist architect, Mies van der Rohe. In any case, what I'm getting at here is the transitions and the ornamentation that you can bring to your drum part, again in the service of the music. Smoothing things over in your ornamentation, you can introduce an element, call it element X in chorus 1, for instance, and then play with that in subsequent variations throughout the song, so that you might have 2x and then x squared, and then take it further, x minus y, x plus y. The good thing that occurs to me about doing these things on your own is that you're not wasting anyone else's time through all these experimentations. No one else is going to be saying, don't do that, that doesn't work, or don't do that, that confuses my part, or whatever. Just take the time to go over the song, try out all these things, find the transitions that make things work the best musically, add the ornamentation that makes it more interesting and spices it up, and again, it's all in service of the song and service of the music.
One question that's often asked about Rush music in particular is the use of odd times in it, and whence that comes. You know, does somebody say, well, we want to do a song in 7 or 12 or 19 or 47? And really, in our case, they're entirely accidental, that they just happen to be in odd times. I think Geddy and Alex just amuse themselves in making up little parts that they like the way they feel and they like the way the rhythm flows over.
and then it's left to me to figure out what they are and try to put a drum part to it. But in modern times, I find even that I spend less time even figuring it out. Why bother? I just try to learn how it feels, again, as a rhythmic piece of music, and respond to it. So a lot of the music on this record might be in 6 or 5 or 12 or something, and I won't necessarily know because I've just learned the feel of the rhythm and tried to learn to apply what I play to falling as a pulse over it and falling in a musically satisfying way rather than being jerky, and rather than drawing a bar line on an odd number of notes, I'll move the bar line to let myself do the change at a more comfortable time in a rhythmic sense for the listener as much as for the musicians. So in our case, the use of odd times is pretty much accidental, and the way that in which we use them is also just because we like the way it feels. It's as simple and as human a response as that, as just liking how something is. Well, I certainly recognize that they're uneven because they're harder to learn. That's really what it comes down to. Like some of these parts and songs were really hard to learn because of that basis that I have to stop and go, wait a minute, what is this made of and how should I approach it? But the solution to a problem like that isn't always counted out and divided into bars and then reproduce it. It's more often just play along with it enough times to become familiar with where the pivot points of the bars are and how far you can stretch them. And there's one of the songs, Carve Away the Stone, the chorus is like that. I'm not sure what time it's in, but I know it's odd time, and I just tried to keep playing straight time as long as I could, and when I had to drop a beat, I did, and then moved on to another long stretch of fluid time, in which I know the bar lines under me are changing, but you have a choice of going with the change or not going with it, really, of playing right over top of it and choosing to make your odd time transition at a whole other place.
Driven up and down in circles, skidding down a road of black ice, staring in and out storm windows, driven to a fool's paradise. It's my turn to drive, but it's my turn to drive, driven to the margin of error, driven to the edge of control, driven to the margin of terror, driven to the edge of a deep dark hole. Driven day and night in circles, spinning like a whirlwind of leaves, stealing in and out back alleys, driven to another den of thieves. It's my turn to drive, but it's my turn to drive, driven to the margin of error, driven to the edge of control, driven to the margin of terror, driven to the edge of a deep dark hole.
Well, this one is chock full of odd times all over the place, as you can hear. We've got 8s and 7s and 8s and 6s and 6s and 6s and all these things going on. But really, when I was presented this song in its drum machine form from the other guys, I didn't stop to figure out these things numerically. I thought it was better just to try to learn to feel them so that I could hope to get some kind of nice feel going across it and root those complex, jagged rhythms in something more flowing and hopefully something a little more funky too. This is another example of each case I've taken a slightly different tack on the on treating those odd time sections. Each verse I've treated a little bit differently to try to give a sense of variety, and yet not make this thing feel as if it were made from a bunch of little pieces. So the first one opens up just with two-handed hi-hat pattern. Bass drum punches home the rhythm. Hopefully, interesting bit of input here that comes from the people that you work with, and the reason why we work with a co-producer, even though we've made so many records over so many years, is that they can think of things that you wouldn't, and always keep the objective eye on things in general. And one thing in this one that our co-producer Peter Collins suggested in the middle section was putting the offbeat bell ride pattern in to try to alleviate the heaviness of the unrelenting six feel and the big block chorded heavy guitar and bass riffs. How he came up with that suggestion, which really helped out a lot in the overall dynamics of the song. And then our mixing engineer, who came in after Cliff Norrell had done all the recording engineering, Andy Wallace came in at the end completely fresh, just as the mixing engineer, and he brought up combinations of things in dynamics and orchestrations that really surprised us, and of course really pleasantly putting a fresh tangent on songs that we'd learned to take for granted in a certain form. And one thing he did in the third verse of this song was mute the dynamics a bit, so when I'm playing the steady ride along with the syncopated rhythms, in that the dynamics have been brought down so that when I go to the double time section at the end, it gives it a complete lift dynamically and rhythmically. And that double time section was a suggestion from Peter Collins, wanting to give the song that feeling so that it bubbled along and percolated with these complex rhythms and then built up to something with a driving force of nature feel about it, of course, which double time is perfectly made for. So that's how I built that up, and carefully had to structure my my transition, because this idea was conceived of at kind of the last minute right here in the studio as we were recording the song. So Peter said, well, let's try double time. So I mocked it up for them to hear, and then I had to go back, as I put it at the time, now I've got to make it feel like a professional. So I had to get out of that rhythmic feel and do a slight build up to a flam as a punctuation again, and from the punctuation take off into the driving double time that would propel the band through the rest of the song, and then to the ride out, which is just jagged intensity, where I get on the second hi-hat and the China cymbal. Incidentally, the only note that my old Wuhan cymbal got used for on this whole record, which has often been my standby for offbeat ride patterns and so on, the one beat it got used in this whole record was the last note of this song. Another decision I was called upon to make here when I first received the demo of the song, trying to sort out how I would orchestrate it, how I would build it dynamically, and from what parts I would do that. There was the one part that was a bass solo, really, with a double track, complex fingered bass part, and I thought, well, I'll just treat this as a bass solo. And getting back to something else I was saying before about being rooted to the hi-hat, I could just keep the hi-hat going steadily through there and syncopate along with his rhythm, again stating the rhythm rather than understating it. I've made that choice sometimes too. In certain of the verses, I play a pattern that really goes around the rhythm, and I'll choose where the downbeat should change to the odd time or whatever, and sometimes let it fall over the bar. But in that one and in the opening verse, I was careful to state the rhythm clearly and get out of the way for the rest of it, because it was a bass solo. Another thing that I've used in here is foreshadowing the double time that's going to come later by setting up in the earlier breaks when the "It's My Turn to Drive" lines are being sung.
It's my turn to drive, but it's my turn to drive.
First, when I'm playing kind of almost a swing pattern on the upbeat across the sixth feel with the hi-hat, the next time with the ride cymbal.
It's my turn to drive, but it's my turn to drive.
Again, if you took it away from the context of the track, you would hear a basic swing pattern with the triplet ride feel. And then the third time that comes around, I've added even a bit of syncopated jazzy phrasing on the left hand.
It's my turn to drive,
take it one step further, and it's right out of the exercises that I described earlier based on the triplet ride pattern and snare pattern that I got from Freddie. So those are tools that I developed through the course of this that I was able to apply to do a very subtle thing, foreshadow something that would happen at the end of the song at intervals throughout the course of the song. Another good example of having a tool ready for you in the toolbox when you need it is double stroke rolls. Again, the thing you start out playing Mama Dada on the pillow and on your knees at school and everything until you finally develop it. But once achieved, like paradiddles and like a good single stroke roll and so many of the rudimental and foundations of rhythm, it becomes useful in a broad variety of ways. In places in this song where I wanted to suspend the time and let a little swell happen between punctuations, double stroke roll was the perfect thing to do that. So I was able to call upon that and use it to swell out and again play games with time in a subtle and interesting way, I hope.
In the pursuit of my other hat-wearing activity, that of putting words together, I was introduced to a book called The Elements of Style. And that could be applied directly to drumming just there, the elements of style. But in this case, Professor Strunk and his former student, E.B. White, put together a guidebook really for the use of words to convey what you want. If you're trying to get across a mood or a texture or an idea or an impression, then it's a question of the order that you present the information in, what serve the reader, what does the reader need to know first, and in what order do you present that information. And in this case, we're talking about serving the song. What impression do you want the listener to receive? What does the song demand? The song has an agenda. The song wants something from you in terms of the rhythmic structure, the dynamic nature, how you can frame the melody, frame the vocal parts, frame the instrumental parts, approach it in those ways. You're trying to get across, too, an idea, a mood, an impression, all of those things that you can accomplish as a drummer. And the song has its agenda. As a drummer, you probably have your own of ideas that you want to get across, things that you'd like to play, things you'd like to use in the song. The band has an agenda for how the band wants to be perceived as a musical unit, of which you are certainly a part. And so you can address all those things at once, I think. You can address the song's needs, the band's needs, and your own needs as a drummer without compromise, but more facing the limitations that are involved there. And for myself, I never like to deal with compromises, but I'm quite happy to deal with the limitations that are necessary to do the job.
I see
serve the song. That's what we're about in this chapter. And that's the problem that I was faced with when I received this song in a demo form and had to start, again, orchestrating how I was going to approach it, how I was going to build it as a drum part, rhythmically and dynamically. Now, the big strumming intro parts seem to suggest right away a tom-tom rolling approach, which is perfectly in keeping also with the theme of the song lyrically in primitive religions and icons in mythology. So it played right into the tribal aspect in a subconscious way, because I certainly never thought of it conceptually, but it rolled out that way, and probably for good reason. Then through the song structures, again, keeping good propulsion going through the verses, so they have a sense of movement to accompany the guitar and the vocal phrasing, and everything has an urgency about it that I wanted definitely to be sympathetic to. And then it builds up through the bridge, and I just keep, again, steady propulsion time, and then it pauses for a second, drops down in a surprise pause downbeat, and then I keep cool time, just kind of accompany and groove along with the song through the choruses each time they appear. And again, with the tom-tom sections, it's a part that needed to be restated as the intro reprise every time it comes around. But of course, I had to do it differently because that's the way I'm made. So I always found a way to resolve that figure differently. Sometimes, again, coming back to the double bass drum triplets, but always interspersing them in a different way, putting the snare in a different place, using more of the floor toms. One time I did, as we discussed before, about the conversational aspect of drum tonality being related to the rhythms and intonations of speaking. I did take a tom-tom roll-up, which is something that you don't often get a chance to do, but is effective because of that, and then resolved it. Instead of coming back down again, came back with an almighty full-stop whack on the snare, and then kicked off into the propulsion of the next verse. So there's examples of keeping the variety going throughout, having a shifting thing, but the time pulse can stay constant throughout it, and then introduce just enough variety into little conclusions or transitions, just enough variety not only to keep you as a player interested, but certainly, of course, to keep your audience interested as well. Now, we've been talking all the way along about having things in your toolbox and being able to bring them out and use them for different jobs, and the conclusion of those rolling tom-tom parts is an example of that. Again, it's the double bass drum triplet, but used in a slightly different context, either rhythmically or against the time. It does quite a different job and ends up sounding as quite a different figure too. So in the examples that I would mention there, I'll just play two samples that are based around that, but they are developments of each other and also tend to build on each other, so that you have X plus 2, X minus 1, different variations of the same fundamental theme being restated with those little features in them. So I'll just play a couple of those now. Again, expansions on the same idea, expressions restating the theme, but with a slight different variation. Now, there's another part in this song where I got to have a little more room, which is guitar solos. Traditionally, as a band, we tend to treat them as band solos to some degree. Being sensitive to the guitar is usually the solo instrument, of course, but at the same time, it's an instrumental passage, so all of us feel a little freer and tend to take more liberties in those. So there's a couple of fills that I've used developing that solo section that I'll just play through and isolate them and highlight them for the sake of illustration. Again, they tend to build each other on a way, but there are also progressions that build towards something perhaps unexpected, where I've used the great tool of anticipation, of building in a pause in the middle of a fill, so suddenly you're not sure what's going on. And then going on towards the end of it on a triplet feel that I guess I kind of picked up from Manu Katché again during the Buddy Rich sessions. He did a really interesting angular little solo along with Mino Sinelu in No Jive, and he did a triplet feel among the toms like that stuck in my head and again became part of my daily practice routine and gradually developed into other kinds of tools that I've used in a couple of different ways throughout this record. So in outlining those, you'll notice that there's a pause built into it. And when I first played it for the other guys, concluding with that crazy triplet roll, they weren't really sure what was going on there. But it's another example of the interactive nature of working in this fashion, that once it became accepted as a rhythmic device and they understood what I was building with it, then everyone else fell into sympathy with it, and Geddy altered his bass part to follow where I was going, and even Alex's guitar solo was phrased to land on the key rhythmic positions of that and resolve his own solo in an unusual and unexpected way. So it's the kind of cross-pollination among the members that can happen like that. One guy takes a chance and the other guys can jump right in and go along with it. So here then is the solo section played a cappella, as it were, and I'll also go the transition into it because it's another illustration of what can be done with the double bass drum triplets, this time against the snare, building up a bit of propulsion and then tension and then releasing into the solo with quite a gentle part for a while, and then it gradually develops into the stages that I've described. So when it comes to putting a song together with the drum part, one of the big advantages that I have is, having been the lyricist, of course, I know what the words are. And at the one extreme of that issue, I know a lot of drummers working in the studio, even in established bands, where the lyrics are the last thing to be written. So they're in there kind of flying blind. They have to make up a drum part that's supposed to be sympathetic to a song and to a vocalist especially, which is, I think, for a drummer, kind of forbidden territory. The last thing you want to do is stomp on the territory of where the singing is going to be. So in my case, at least, that's one thing I know. Before I know what the drum part is, I know what the lyrics are going to be, so it allows me to frame them and to be more adventurous, too. Again, it allows me to take chances beyond playing it safe and beyond keeping it simple, because I know where I can punch up behind the vocals. Where he's going to fall rhythmically is a place that maybe I can do something to support it or to give a strange turnaround or twist on it. And when it comes to putting in fills, again, it's kind of a sacrosanct thing that I don't play fills under a singing part. It's just something like a soloist too. You don't want to go mucking with somebody's little spotlight. So when it's fills involved in a chorus, transitions, or anything like that, I can always frame the vocals in them rather than having to be intrusive. So it's an opportunity for me to know how the whole song is going to be in the end, which I know for a lot of drummers don't pay attention to vocals and at their peril, because it's really what a lot of the music stems from. Of course, it's words and music. And the other extreme, as I said, unfortunately, a lot of drummers who have to work without knowing what the lyrics are going to be at all, even if they do care about it. And in my case, at least, I have the opportunity to marry the both of them from the beginning. Keep it simple, stupid. Don't you really love to hear that? KISS. To me, that often leads to LOVE. Leave out virtually everything, so that you're not allowed to be creative or to add something to the band's music because you're the lowly drummer, the lowly timekeeper. Seems to me what we should be looking for is MUSIC. Make up something interesting and complimentary. Serve the song, serve the music, but by all means try to be creative and imaginative in how you affect it. Simplicity can be beautiful, complexity can be beautiful, and equally, both can also be not beautiful. In the hands of a master, simplicity can be a gorgeous thing. If you think of drummers like Steve Gadd or Bernard Purdie, when they play something simply, it's with the conviction, the confidence, the knowledge and ability of a master, and consequently it communicates itself in quite a different way from somebody who's playing something simple because it's all they know. And those people equally will be likely to say that, hey man, less is more. But really, less is only and always less.
what we like to say in the band, that less costs more. In other words, if you're going to do something simple and be minimalistic about it, then it better be exceptionally great. And this is true, I think, throughout the arts. If you think of Picasso, for instance, as a wonderful painter, but also as a wonderful drawer. And he could do a few lines in a gestural line drawing that would capture the essence of beauty. And that's the essence of what simplicity can be. But at the same time, something more complex, something more overwrought, more involved, more imagination, more ideas. What's wrong with that? My take on all of this is that the apprentice takes something easy and makes it look difficult, while the master takes the impossible and makes it look easy.
Once again, of course, this is another odd time exercise, drifting in and out of various time signatures from 5 and 4 and who knows what all in between. Truth to tell, I never did stop to figure them out. I figured, as with one of the other tunes, that it was better for me just to learn to feel the time, learn to feel where the bar lines fall and how I can rhythmically enhance them without stopping to break it down mathematically. So the whole intro section, in which actually all three of us are just playing the punches against a fugue kind of approach of the keyboard, drifting in and out over top of them. I just learned the feel of that melodically and rhythmically so that I could feel it through and play it. The hi-hat stays steady all the way through that, so there's no jaggedness or roughness. It's all syncopated around a common pulse. And then there are places in this where the 5/4 sections come, where I've chosen sometimes to treat them as very jagged, like right off the top, where it's so it suggests that automatically. Other times when that comes around in the middle section where the alternating vocal lines of the mighty ocean dances with the moon. That's another advantage of having written the lyrics, is knowing what they are and the imagery that they convey, because they open with the mighty ocean. It's kind of an oppressive, heavy, forceful thing, so the jagged, angular approach to it is quite appropriate. And then it goes into the image of dancing with the moon, and it's gentle, and it stays in 5, but everyone takes a delicate approach to those second 2 bars of 5, and then comes back to the angular approach again and alternates them to forceful and oppressive, and then light and gentle and quite pretty. So it makes a contrast of one type signature is going through there. We make a choice to treat it as an angular and jagged thing, or to treat it as a smooth thing and try to gloss over the fact that it's even an odd time signature at all. So I'm just going to go through the physical exercise of playing those two back to back, because it also illustrates the body language that you go for in going for those. And I'm putting an angular, jagged approach into playing those sections that are that way. And then for the lighter, gentler ones, I'm just kind of drifting along on top of the beat and trying not to intrude. Just let it drift through and make it feel as smooth, as gentle, and as much like dancing with the moon as I can.
I think one of the best tricks that an old dog can learn is how to trick yourself. And I know that for myself, one of my weaknesses is the tendency to be over-rehearsed, so that I like to come into a recording or a tour or whatever arena of performance as well prepared as I can be, and I don't mind at all sitting by myself and rehearsing over the tunes again and again. But of course, when it's dealing with recording where you want to catch the freshness of a performance, there's a danger of becoming stale and over-rehearsing the part beyond any sense of spontaneity or even any spark of passion in it. So I've learned that now I can have both, that I can rehearse a song as much as I want, as long as I'm careful not to block out each little part. So I'm always careful these days to leave certain segments, certain transitions, certain fills open, and try to juggle them as I go through. Every time I rehearse the song, I'll try hard to let my mind be a blank and let whatever comes out happen. And maybe collect input on what works best and what doesn't, but essentially try to keep it fresh and a little bit dangerous every time. There's a good little phrase that I like to use that applies to many aspects of my life, from cross-country skiing to motorcycling to drumming, is that danger plus survival equals fun. And many times the enjoyment or the value in an activity lies in the risk that you're willing to hazard in it, and certainly holds true for adventure travel too. The experience that you hope to gain is often inverse ratio to the amount of risk that you're willing to take for it. And in drumming, that comes to, in, as I described, setting yourself up for a lot of rehearsal, but to take chances throughout every single performance of that song, right up until the time it's recorded. And I was describing this process to our co-producer Peter Collins, and he came up with another felicitous phrase to describe that. He said, "Don't leave spontaneity to chance." And I thought that really described exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to be spontaneous, but not in a haphazard way. So there were certain songs, like the song called Resist on this record, in which I kept juggling all the elements of the song, all the different fills and rhythmic patterns, but I wouldn't let myself cement them down into an orchestrated part. Every time through, I just tried to juggle them in a different way, feel which ones maybe worked better in a different segment or whatever, but ultimately let the part itself and the performance dictate how those things would flow out, such that when I was in the studio, if I played 3/4 of the song and suddenly fell apart for whatever reason, I wouldn't be able to pick it up from there. It would be necessary to go right back to the top of the song and deliver the whole song as a complete performance.
I can learn to resist anything but temptation. I can learn to coexist with anything but pain. I can learn to compromise anything but my desires. I can learn to get along with all the things I can't dictate. I can learn to resist anything but frustration. I can learn to persist with anything but aching love. I can learn to close my eyes to anything but injustice. I can learn to get along with all the things I don't know. I can learn to resist anything but temptation. I can learn to coexist with anything but pain. I can learn to compromise anything but my desires. I can learn to get along with all the things I can't explain. You can surrender without a prayer, but never really pray. Pray without surrender. You can fight without ever winning, but never ever win. Win without a fight. I can learn to close my eyes to anything but ever try. I can learn to get along with all the things I don't know. I can learn to close my eyes to anything but injustice. I can learn to get along with all the things I don't know.
So here's another example of a lot of orchestrating work to do for me in conceiving a drum part for this song when I heard it basically as a demo. Incidentally, I made my debut on hammer dulcimer on this, playing the parts along with the piano sequence. It was quite a thrill. And so generally conceiving this part, of course, it's in a lilting kind of six, and I didn't want to lose that lilt, so my initial demos of making a stab at the part were based around that. And when Peter Collins came to join us, out in our country places, we were working on the pre-production. He suggested ways to make it more original and more interesting, trying to get some kind of a tribal approach to it. Now, being a lilty 6/8, that was difficult to accomplish, and I tried many different variations over the course of a few days to try to get at different ways of making that work, and eventually arrived at a more of a punctuated rhythmic piece that has the dark feel of toms, but isn't exactly tribal, but introduces the feeling a little bit, and also gave me some melodic variations to use around the kit. For instance, when there's a descending vocal line ending the verses, you can hear that I follow Geddy's voice down with the toms and punctuate them both rhythmically and melodically. It's a nice thing to be able to do. Another thing in the opening where I open without the snare at all when I introduce the rhythm, just with the toms and hi-hat and bass drum. And then the first entrance of the snare is again a double stroke roll, pulling out the tool that you need at the right time and building up in a kind of like a wave. You don't have to imply the time or play the time at all. Just build up with that nice double stroke.
I can learn to get along with all the things I can't explain.
So that's a handy little device to use. Climax after the breakdown section of the middle bridge, where it's just vocal and guitar in a very intimate part, and then I gradually introduce a rolling hi-hat part, and then we go into a part that we always refer to as the flying brick. What we professionals call the flying brick, which is always any kind of a staccato build. And this one we start building it quite gently, and then build it up through stages, and then arrive at another use for something I alluded to before, which is the triplet feel pattern across straight time. And in this case, I'm using the toms and snare combination of that to introduce my fill in an unusual way and put me in an unusual place when I build my way out of it and then back into time again. A couple of other big fills that I'll also look at are ways that I've used anticipation. And these are places where I'm bridging from the slow lilting sort of halftime with the rhythmic punctuations. Now I want to go to straight time. And I'm going to be playing 4/6 in these two sections of the song, which is something that, again, our band does a lot and has for years, that there'll be 6 songs that are in 6, but we'll choose to play straight time over top of them, and it allows you to have a rock feel over top of what could be essentially a lilting rhythm. So beginning with the anticipation, here I am building from the lilting halftime rhythmic feel, and then using fills with pauses built into them to build anticipation and tension, and then the tension release as the fill descends again conversationally and comes into the straight time. So and finally, the flying brick builds up where I've used the triplet feel to set me up for a flow out of it, and then a release into the halftime. So it was calling for quite a different transition that I wanted to make. So as a consequence, I've approached it differently, both rhythmically and in the construction of it. So we're building up out of nowhere with the... etc. I'm going to try to slow that down. Again, it's not easy to do sometimes, but we'll give it a shot. Don't leave spontaneity to chance, and it's the way I really approach this whole performance. And even the fills that I'm demonstrating, they evolved out of a lack of planning, really. I had just juggled them every time I rehearsed the song and played through it, worked over my arrangement. I would let these things happen and literally just kind of close my eyes and close my brain and see what would happen. And the ultimate performance becomes something that builds out of itself and becomes an organic flow that I couldn't interrupt or join halfway through. All of these fills had to happen as a consequence of each other and as a consequence of the spirit of the performance, given the good tension of the studio that drives you always that little bit extra higher. I've alluded before to the hi-hat, to the triplet ride pattern that I use sometimes just as a silent little pulse level or something to keep the lilt happening. Now here in 6/8 I have a lilt that's overt, so I'm using that triplet ride as a key part of the rhythm. It also contributes to the lilt in an implicit way, but in this case I've been explicit with it and let it be a riding part of it. It's important to recognize too, in a lot of the technique that might be used in all these parts, the parts themselves are good, and certainly throughout all my years of playing, I've spent time learning these things and worrying about them. But ultimately, as we've tried to stress, it's about serving the song and about orchestrating the song and finding the parts you need, the tools you need to make the transitions as you envision them in your head. So imagination is the master here, the song is the master, and the technique can only be the servant of the imagination. And for me, as I've described, technique can often be a hard-won thing, facility on the drum set, and developing a new, looser sense of time. These are all hard-won things for me that have always been the result of a lot of work. So the great gift is imagination, and then a little work and application and sweat can provide you with all the rest.
Yeah, well, here I am doing my warm-up routine. It's part of my practice routine every day as well. Or if I'm rehearsing for a session or doing recording, whatever, I like to come in and get both loosened up and warmed up. And this is based on one of the earliest exercises that Freddie gave me, just a simple triplet pattern on ride and snare with these little syncopations added in. And it's really designed from his point of view to develop a time feel, as I've discussed, about getting a pulse rather than a metrical feel toward time. So this is getting me into that groove, and then to keep myself interested, because I get bored easily, I introduce a lot of variations just to play with things in time, always rooted to the hi-hat and rooted to that pulse time feel. It's important to recognize too, although this seems to be based on a swing pattern, it's a pulse that I've found just as valuable for other things. And learning how to swing has everything to do with learning how to rock. And as I go through this, I generally come up into rock beats as well as variations on this time. But again, always trying to base it on this triplet pulse feel. Now in each day's rehearsal session or each day's warm-up, this is kind of a little voyage of discovery too. I'm constantly discovering new permutations, new syncopations, new ways to get accents, some of them that I've been using for years, but not quite in this context of being so rooted to the hi-hat and again to the pulse feel of time. Onto the upbeat and started doing different variations on the same sort of figures but from a different time base. Here combining the upbeat hi-hat feel of a swing pattern and yet playing downbeats on the snare and ride patterns as if in a rock beat. play a bit here with two-handed ride patterns. Again, still keeping the pulse of the upbeat foot hi-hat. It's important to realize too, these are both physical exercises and mental exercises. And I set up little puzzles to try to solve along the way and see how much I can basically get away with in a certain context. Just kind of exploring all over the place, seeing what I can do while still being rooted to that pulse feel. Trying to wake up that left hand now. Little hi-hat interlude too. A lot of these things are designed for reasons here to get the hands working in good sync with each other. And this relates, of course, to singles and double strokes on the snare. A lot of the figures that I work around appear in different songs on this record, different figures that have become part of my modern repertoire that I've used in the songs and thus become part of my warm-up and the exploration too. Here I'm often putting them in a different rhythmic context with the hi-hat on the upbeat instead of the downbeat, things like that. See the hands starting to get warmed up now, willing to do some work. Now it's time to say good morning to the toms. Good stuff for shoulders and arms here, the crossovers. Get everything loosened up right up into the shoulders. lot of what-if kind of exploring I get through here, where I'm just trying, well, what would happen if I do this? What would happen if I do that? If I set up a rhythmic tom sort of open snare effect and then just go wild, just see where I can go with it. Another check on how the single stroke's coming along that day. And the double barometer for me, I know when I can get it really smooth and fast, that's when I'm warmed up. A little free-form stuff, bring some double bass drums in. Get around the kit a little better now. And now we move into the samba movement. Something I picked up from one of the guys in our crew. Skip was touring with another band down in Brazil and came back with a CD by Milton Banana, supposed to be Brazil's Buddy Rich. And I was really taken by, I've always liked the Latin feel anyway, and particularly the Brazilian one. So samba just became part of my little warm-up because I like it, and also because it takes me some interesting places rhythmically. A little skipping along bass drum against the hi-hat, and then alternate syncopations with side stick toms and ride cymbal, of course. Again, little games I play to see what I can get away with within a certain context. Quite a disciplined little hi-hat and bass drum pattern, but it's amazing how loose you can make it feel and how you can pull the time in and around. Different kinds of syncopations, triplet feel things. Again, under all this noise, that pulse keeps going on. It's an example, too, of, again, a tool that's worth developing even if you don't get a chance to use it, because it just increases your facility and your confidence on the drum set. And it gives you something interesting to do while you're practicing, too. It doesn't have to be boring. A more angular approach, again, keeping that same samba pulse. Now we take a rock stab at it. I shall use this one day in a song. Now we're leading towards the shuffle feel, which I use for a particular exercise that Freddie gave me, which involves rolling the hand over, and something that I hope to develop further in coming years so that my big downbeat on the snare will result from a snap of the wrist. So here I'm doing it, trying to put into effect what Freddie showed me, and rather than just doing the exercise, which with my short attention span gets boring and tedious, I developed it into a little shuffle beat that allows me to explore some other things at the same time while having a daily dose of that particular exercise. I'll push and pull the time around while I'm doing it and seeing what feels good and what's nice to play and what else I can get away with in that same context. Just as I like to work on my drum parts for rush parts on my own so I'm not wasting anyone else's time. Same thing applies in practicing. That's when I do take all the big chances that I would never take on stage in front of an audience, or probably not even in an official recording situation where I'm trying to do as good a job as I can, as quickly as I can. Here, this is just me. No one else is involved, so whatever I do, however badly it comes out, it doesn't matter. I usually tend to play this a little faster than a shuffle needs to be, but just because I work on that left hand exercise, and if I do it a little faster, of course, it's a little more effective as an exercise. Another interesting approach to drum set too is being rooted with the left hand, and the right foot in the right hand is doing some exploring around and again seeing what it can get away with, while the left hand and hi-hat stay quite rooted to the rhythm, so they actually carry the shuffle. And then back again to Freddie's original exercise, settle me into the pulse. Time to get the feet working. Seven. Just a little free jazz all by myself. Again, working on all the little tools though I want to be able to apply later in the day if I'm going to be recording or rehearsing the tunes or whatever. These are all things that I need as part of that. Paradiddle time. A good rudimentary workout is always a good thing.
one of Buddy's little moves there. Keep the single stroke going with the left hand. And again, just doing a little barometric check on myself, see how that single stroke's coming along today. Oh, I'm going to play time. Well, we all have to do it sometimes. Not for long, though. There'll be lots of time playing later when I have to get serious for the job. I guess I'm warmed up now. A writer friend of mine introduced me to the original meaning of the term masterpiece. It seems that in medieval times, in the days of the craftsmen and hand workers, whether you were a carver or a painter or any kind of the artisans in the crafts, you would have to serve a long apprenticeship, and then eventually you might be allowed to submit a piece of work to the masters and perhaps be accepted among their number. And I thought that was a much nicer take on it, since I consider myself to be an endless apprentice and a perpetual student. For these last 30 years, I've been working towards some kind of understanding and mastery of the instrument. So what I was hoping for is not necessarily to elevate myself to the masters, many of whom I was privileged to work with on the Burning for Buddy tribute, but perhaps to take myself up to the level of a graduate student or a first-class apprentice. One aspect of Rush's music that is more or less unique, of course, is our continuing return to instrumentals, and one of our early ones was even subtitled An Exercise in Self-Indulgence. That's partly how we look at them. Of course, we try to give them an overriding musical value and structural value as well as being a vehicle for us to explore musically, both individually and as a group. A song like Limbo, which is the instrumental on this record, is kind of an interesting case because as they are in a song, trying to find words and music that marry well together, and there inevitably are great parts that we love which just haven't found a home yet. In former years it would have been our habit just to stick them in some song just because we could and because we wanted to, but we try hard in the arrangement side of what we do now to be more structured about it, I guess you'd say. So there's much less aimless meandering than in the exploratory part of our career, I guess you'd say, the first 10 years or so, when we were just trying things because we could, and why not? Why wouldn't a guy? So in the case of Limbo, a lot of those parts had just not found their home yet in other songs, and we were determined once again to have an instrumental, and Geddy and Alex were also determined to use the great parts that they hadn't found a place for yet. So this song, it gradually came about piece by piece over the course of several weeks, really, and was being worked on until the night before it was recorded. We were in there with all these demos on computer and still making edits and moving parts around and changing chorus verse relationships and changing till the last minute, which is again a bit of a nightmare for a drummer, but it's for the sake of making it better and tying all those, giving them a common rhythmic base, giving them some commonality musically, an overall dynamic structure, an architecture, if you will, of how the song should hang together as a piece of music. And then other aspects of it that came from a personal agenda. For instance, with all I've learned in the last couple of years drumming-wise and all the new areas that I had to explore, I did really want a solo spot somewhere in this record and some kind of a drum break that was a little more extended. So knowing that this instrumental was under construction, I started plotting on my own, and one night during one of my practice sessions at the pre-production studio, I just got the engineer to make me up 16 bars of click track, and I just started playing with it, and I was determined not to count bars and not to try to make a fixed little musical part that I could then learn and repeat, but just something completely fresh and completely unpredictable. So I basically just started playing to this click track without counting bars, just playing anything that I wanted to, just
totally at random and completely wild. And sometimes I would end up a bar short or 2 beats short or 1.5 beats too long or whatever had happened. But I just kept going and going until I got something that fell into that 16 bars that contained all of the elements that I was hoping to include rhythmically, and said, okay, that's it. And I didn't let myself mess with it anymore. I subsequently gave that piece of tape to Getty, who was doing the arrangement work in the computer for Limbo. And he took it into the computer and divided it up into 2 separate pieces, and put one at the front of the song and one in the middle, and then orchestrated a bass part with, this would be Peter Collins' suggestion, which is another example of the kind of interplay that comes into play on a thing like this. And Peter Collins suggested orchestrating a bass part to go with those drum solo parts, and again to tie them more thematically into the song as a piece of music rather than a collection of snippets or even a collection of solos. So then it came about that I suddenly had divided this up, and he divided what was 16 bars. He took in 4-bar groups and switched them all around in different orders. So I hadn't got a hope of playing this ever again in my life, and but I had to learn it because I wanted to record it, of course, fresh for the album when we came here to Bearsville. So there I was in the situation of sitting down to take something that I'd not only played completely off the cuff and without any malice aforethought, but also something that somebody else had taken and snipped up into 4 separate bits and stitched them together in a whole other way. So I had to sit down for several days and woodshed on those parts just to be able to reproduce them for the record, and again to be able to reproduce them live when it comes to the concert stage too, as is often the case with bits of music that have been invented spontaneously in the studio or have come to pass so quickly as this one. Again, big changes going on in its structure the night before it was recorded meant that even when I was recording it, I wasn't really that sure of how it went, just hoping to make my way through. So there's an example of all the pieces that can go into making a song like Limbo.
So, okay, although this is an instrumental and is meant to be somewhat of an exercise in self-indulgence and a bit whimsical and frivolous along the way, it is still, after all, a song and is addressed as such from a basic orchestration point of view. And I had choices to make here and decisions to apply in problem solving and getting from one place to another as smoothly and effectively as possible. Certain recurring parts, like what we have always called the oriental section, the little harmonics part that I introduced just simply on a triplet ride pattern, again with bass drum punctuation, and then the side stick comes in on the quarter notes with that. The second time that part comes around, I've given it quite a different effect, almost a tribal, really more of a tabla kind of feel. And again, my tool in this case was paradiddles, to put the sticks in the notes where I wanted them to fall in the figure. It was paradiddles that would allow me to do that. And then the third time that same piece of music comes around, I just had a time feel that comes back on the third and kind of lilts along with it. And then I do a couple of little syncopations, snare drum, bass drum, and then back into the time again. So it's a case where three pieces come up with an atmospheric job to do, and in each case I found a different way to approach it, shift the atmosphere somewhat, but remain true to the needs of the part, what the part dictated it wanted to be, and different possible characters it could be. And the choruses throughout have a kind of a caravan of camels across the desert feel, so again I've been conscious of that and used tom figures as part of my timekeeping rhythm to keep that figure alive. I'm just going to look at a couple of those specifically. The paradiddles, I think, bear examination in the way they break down to make a rhythm like that, and why it could only be a paradiddle that would allow me to have the smoothness and fluidity that I wanted that part to have as a rolling motion, but also put the notes in the places where I wanted them to be melodically. So that comes in with a out of the 4/4 time. 1, 2, 3, 4. Out, which is, again, I have built up the suspense and the tension by holding up on the higher notes, and then as I'm transiting down, just bringing it down as an emphatic downbeat in again to the caravan feel of the choruses. A couple of particular fills that come into play here, using elements that we've looked at before. In the opening solo sections, I've described how they came about. Some of the pieces that I used for those, because they were relatively fresh to me, have drawn upon, for instance, we mentioned the triplet feel we've looked at before, how I used it from ride cymbal to snare, how I used it from toms to snare. In this case, in the opening of it, I use the figure from tom to hi-hat, and it gives it a whole different character, and I don't think it would be identified as the same rhythm, but it's built upon those same blocks. I'm just going to try to walk through some of the elements of the opening solo section and the pieces that it's made of, just for illustration. But it's important to realize, really, it's not about demonstrating my personal box of tools or anything. It's just an element of how I use these things to build something on a larger scale. In every case, there's a larger conception, whether it's devoted to the song, or in this case, why I wanted some fresh for me approaches to rhythmically building up a drum solo section, which ended up being accompanied, of course, by a couple of different variations of that same approach that I'll demonstrate as we go along. Now here, as much as I can break this part down, because it was another gift of spontaneity, but I've been trying to learn the pieces that I put together on that day. So. So it can be seen there, I've introduced some melody into it, as well as some very jagged, angular pieces, smoother triplets, all kinds of elements that have gone together to create what I hoped would be an interesting and ear-catching little piece. And then the second time that comes around, again, I've used some of my new left-hand technique to get double strokes happening, alternate to each other on that, then a restatement of the triplet feel. And what I work up to as the climax of this second piece is a thing that I've used over the years. It's a series of 4-note groupings that I've described in different contexts sometimes before in songs in the past, reaching right back to YYZ and older instrumentals I've used them in, and quite a lot really throughout, because it's one of my things that I think is my own, and if it's not, I'm treating it as if it were. And the way they arise in this one, as they fall across time, is in this case, though, I've introduced a tom note to give them a slightly angular and more unusual feel, and also, again, a way in which I haven't used them before. So it's another way that I could get at something new for me, built out of something that, in a case like that. So. That's the way that I've chosen to use them, again, as the climax of this piece, and then building tension, and then it releases into just a straight swing ride pattern with a look at how building blocks that we've looked at before I've brought into play in different ways here, and will again later in the song. So we're coming out of the chorus. Then on to into the rising dissonant part, again building tension, which will be again released. And in this case, I've used another combination of that 4-note grouping, which releases into the third reprise of what we've called the Oriental section, for lack of better terminology. So when I've come out of that, I'll just do a bit of that building pattern in the dissonant section, and then another approach to that 4-note groupings, and then coming down into the halftime feel into the third Oriental section. So we're building. And then onward from there. Now the next time it comes around where I'm building into the chorus, I used another thing where I thought, okay, I can get at a different thing rhythmically, which is a triplet feel descending tom roll. Over the years, I'll say that I've used a lot of different kinds of descending tom rolls, but this was again a fresh way for me to get at something that I have addressed in the past in other ways. So we're coming in that case out of a verse feel, which in this time, the third time around the verse, again I've moved to the ride cymbal just for variety, done the same sort of syncopated pushes and shoves around on it, and then build out of that through my descending triplet feel, and then come in, hold it again, using anticipation, using suspense. I've kept the triplet feel going over the bar line, and then come in with a crash well into the bar. And then that's another case where I set up that idea during the demo stage. The other guys in the band respond to that, and Geddy and Alex both adjust their parts then to follow what I've put in, just as I would do with their parts if there was a chance to be more empathetic. So here we go from the verse feel, transiting through the descending triplet feel into the chorus, caravan of camels across the desert. And then onward in that we're going to come back to the building blocks of these triplets from toms to snare. At the end we have a series of false endings, which is done partly to amuse ourselves, but also again as a different way to do something. So the song actually ends, picks up, ends. So I've left a couple of those blanked again to capitalize on that tension of the pause, the anticipation of what's going to happen, and then later on I start filling those in. First I bring in just the straight triplet one right across the bar line, so it feels a little unusual. And then the last one, I do something that I alluded to before, which is faster triplet feel across the time again, just rising up quickly, starting quiet and building quickly, and then boom, releasing into the very last time of the repeat chorus. One of the great arguments in human anthropology and many fields of human activity is nature versus nurture. Is it more important what you are or how you're taught? Is it heredity or environment? And in drumming, this comes to pass in the divisions that there seem to be between so-called field drummers and academic technical drummers, if you like. And it's really a conflict that I've never understood, but I understand where it comes from. And there are drummers that you will hear that are proud to say that they've never had a lesson and they don't practice and so on. And sometimes that may be true. There are great natural talents, and Buddy Rich was one certainly that claimed he didn't practice, and no one would argue that he needed to. And yet, as my teacher, Freddie Gruber, said about Buddy, he said, when you start playing at 18 months old and you're studying the best drummers in the world from the time you're 3 years old, you don't need drum lessons, you don't need to practice, and that's Buddy. Buddy was a force of nature. And maybe there are other exceptions and anomalies like that too, but I think for most of us, what we do is only improved by the exploring that we do in other styles of music, or the practicing that we do on our own time, and the amount of actual work that we do, of course, on the concert stages and in the studios of the world. So all of that comes to bear, and that's part of the nurture. And whatever talent you're given, you can maximize that, of course, nurture it as well as you can. And I have a friend who's a professional baseball player, Warren Cromartie, and I was telling him my story about that in regard to my own drumming, how for me I need to practice and I need to study in order to improve or even get good to begin with. And Warren told me a funny story for himself, because he felt that he was the same kind of baseball player, in the same way that Ty Cobb also said he was, that he thought he had to work twice as hard as anyone else because he simply didn't have a lot of natural ability. And Warren Cromartie was telling me he would show up at spring training in baseball, and he'd have worked out all through the off season, and developed his body and worked on his swinging in the batting cage and worked on his throwing, and every aspect of his game, tried to keep it at least as good as it was, or improve it if he could. And then he'd show up at spring training, and some of the other players would have been laying around drinking beer all through the off season, and they would just be effortlessly excellent without even trying. And how much it used to make him annoyed, and as it does me too, when I think of that, the amount of effort that I have to put in what I do, and how much nicer it would be if it just came. But nevertheless, that is the reality. It's only hard work that pays off, and I know that for me, when I practice a lot, it makes me better. And it's a trap that Geddy mentioned, that just before we did the recording, he'd been practicing, making sure that he had his bass playing facility together, and he came in one day and said, this practicing business is a dirty, rotten trap. You do it for a while, and then you feel yourself getting better, and then you feel like you ought to keep doing it every day.
You can roll that stone to the top of the hill, drag your ball and chain behind you. You can carry that weight with an iron will, or let the pain remain behind you.
Oh, here's another song, obviously, that's constructed out of a certain amount of odd time work. And again, I don't think Alex and Getty think about these things. They just work out a musical passage that they like and a modulation that they like and never stop to think about what time signature it's in. And that's fine because I don't either. And in this case, I just sat down again. I'll just play it. I don't want to count it out and figure out what it is mathematically. I have done since, by the way, and it's 7s and 5s alternating, which interestingly, of course, adds up to 12. So I have the choice of being able to play 4 across that if I wish to, which I do most of the time, just to keep the flow going rhythmically and try to get a really nice bouncing quarter note feel. So I play right across those changes as the 7s and 5s alternate. And then the second time around in that cycle, all of us pick up with the with that syncopated little conclusion to the phrase, boom, boom, boom. And I treat that 3 different ways through the course of the song. The first time I just flam down to the bass drum and let it stop and have that little hesitation, which can be so dramatic. And then the second time around, I do a little build on the China cymbal back up to the flow of the rhythm again. And then the third time around, I do a descending tom figure to mimic that doo-doo-doo, again following the melody, using that as my key. use also, of course, the vocal phrasing very often is my key to punch up. And in the final repeat of the chorus, for instance, where I could get working on my own, the way he phrases that line across the rhythm, I've chosen to depart from the previous roadmap of things to follow the vocals and punch up what he's doing, because it's the concluding line of the song vocally. And it's a chance for me to step out into a place where I belong, which is, of course, supporting the singer. A couple of other things that we've alluded to along the way, the double bass drum figures. There's an illustration of that coming up in the at the very last part of the ride out on this song, which is a one little fill which I use on off of the toms, coming back up into time again, and then ending the whole thing with a flurry of a double bass drum roll with cymbals, because it's the conclusion, which the bass and guitar ended up mimicking, because it's the concluding phrase, da-da-da-da-da, and it sets the whole song finishes on a very positive note, both rhythmically and melodically. So I'm just going to play through that last section of time where I introduced those two bass drum fills, just because, again, it's not something new. It's something we've talked about before, but it's used in a different place and in a different way. And it, again, as I keep stressing, for a purpose that I had in mind, a choice that I made about how to treat this song. Different parts of it, if it's 6, sometimes I'm playing 4 over the 6. Sometimes I let the 6 breathe through a little more. Sometimes I just drive it through. So playing through the concluding ride out of the song. So we can see, after all this talk and all this demonstration, that my music, my drumming, is very much a reflection of my character, the way I am. I like to be well planned, but at the same time, I like to be spontaneous. Don't leave spontaneity to chance. I like to be organized, but at the same time, I'm restless for change, for movement, for learning, for traveling. That's my essential contradiction. That's my yin and yang. My ideal of life is not a well-ordered environment, not a quiet room, a well-packed suitcase, and to be on my way somewhere interesting. In drumming, as in life, it's the same. You want to have a well-packed suitcase or a well-stocked toolbox, and then set off on a journey to somewhere strange and beautiful.